Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Ethan Thompson stepped out of the taxi, the cool air of the city hitting his face as he stood in front of the old building. He had arrived. After months of searching for a place to live in the bustling city, this small, rundown apartment was going to be his new home. It was far from perfect, but it was cheap, and it would do. After all, the job he had just moved for was too important to let the imperfections of a building stand in his way. The building itself was an old brownstone, its once majestic exterior now weathered by years of neglect. The windows were dirty, the brickwork chipped in places, and the faint scent of mildew hung in the air. But Ethan didn't mind. In fact, he kind of liked it. It had character. It had a story. And for someone who was starting over, that seemed appropriate. He grabbed his suitcase and headed inside. The hallway smelled faintly of must and dust, and the light flickered overhead. The walls, a dull shade of yellow, looked like they hadn't been repainted in decades. The floors creaked beneath his shoes as he made his way down to the door at the far end, the one marked with a small brass plaque reading, Apartment 3B. Ethan reached into his pocket for the key, feeling a twinge of excitement mixed with apprehension. He had already paid the first month's rent, signed the lease. This was it. His new life, his new chapter. No more roommates, no more sharing space. Just him. The door opened with a quiet creak. The apartment was smaller than he'd imagined. The living room was bare except for a sagging couch and a small coffee table. The kitchen was tucked into a corner, its white cabinets looking faded and stained. But it wasn't horrible. He could work with this. It was just the start. As he walked further into the space, the dim light revealed a hallway that led to two doors. One was already open, revealing a small, empty bedroom. The other door was slightly ajar, the room hidden in shadow. Ethan glanced at it, wondering about the strange, almost oppressive silence in the apartment. No voices, no sounds of people, just the steady hum of the refrigerator. It felt too quiet, but maybe that was what he needed. A fresh start, a space of his own. He dropped his suitcase on the couch and sat down, taking a deep breath. There was no one here. Not yet, anyway. This was his time to settle in. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a message from his parents or a reminder about his new job, but instead, it was a text from his best friend, Marcus. "How's the new place?" Ethan smiled and typed back quickly. "It's fine. A little older than I expected, but I think I'm going to like it here." He sat back on the couch, looking around at the bare apartment. The silence in the room was so thick that it felt almost tangible. He wondered if it was the type of place that would start to feel alive over time. The kind of place where your own thoughts filled up every inch of space. After a moment, the silence was broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. A whisper. It was faint at first, a barely audible murmur. Ethan furrowed his brow and glanced around, unsure if he had imagined it. The whisper came again, clearer this time, a soft, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He stood up, feeling a chill rush through him. It had to be the building settling. Old places did that, right? The wind? A neighbor? Maybe someone was having a conversation through the walls. Ethan walked toward the door of the room at the end of the hallway, the one that was slightly ajar. The whisper seemed to be coming from there. It wasn't quite a voice, but more like the sound of someone mumbling in their sleep. He hesitated before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was empty. Dust clung to the windowsills, and sunlight filtered in from the cracked blinds, casting a pale glow across the wooden floor. The room smelled musty, like no one had lived in it for a while. There was nothing strange about it, nothing out of place. Just a bare, forgotten room. Yet, the longer Ethan stood there, the more he felt as if something was wrong. Like he wasn't alone. As though someone had just been there and was still, somehow, nearby. A slight shiver ran down his spine. He quickly turned on his heel and walked back to the living room, his heart rate picking up as he closed the door behind him. The whisper had stopped, but the eerie feeling lingered. He tried to dismiss it. It was just the old building. It had to be. Trying to shake off the unease, Ethan set his phone down on the coffee table and made his way to the kitchen to start unpacking. As he moved around the space, putting dishes away and setting up a few small things, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The quiet was oppressive, suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint thud in the walls, made him stop and listen. His breath hitched, and he stepped back, a chill creeping up his spine. The whispering of the night before returned in a slow, slithering murmur, barely audible but unmistakable. It's nothing, he thought, but the words sounded weak in his own mind. Ethan turned and left the room, trying to ignore the increasing feeling of being watched. He didn't want to dwell on it. He had to be getting paranoid. This place was old, sure, but it wasn't haunted. He couldn't let himself fall into that kind of thinking. The rest of the day was a blur of unpacking and setting up. Ethan took a walk around the neighborhood, trying to distract himself from the creeping thoughts that had started to cling to him like cobwebs. When he returned to the apartment that evening, he found it eerily quiet again. He set down his bag, walked into the kitchen to make some dinner, and began humming to himself, trying to keep the silence at bay. But the feeling was there again, the constant pressure of being observed, like someone's eyes were on him from the dark corners of the room. It was a strange sensation, one he couldn't shake. And then, as he was stirring a pot of pasta, he heard it again. The whisper. It was clearer this time. No longer a vague sound in the distance. It was coming from behind him. He froze. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly turned, but there was no one there. Only the quiet stillness of the apartment, mocking him. He turned back to the stove, tried to ignore it, but the whisper grew louder. It was almost as if the walls themselves were speaking, each whisper like a soft, insistent breath. Ethan, it was his name, just a faint murmur in the air. His pulse quickened. He spun around, but the room was empty. There was no one there. The kitchen felt colder now. He felt the hairs on his neck stand on end, and the urge to leave the apartment surged within him. He took a step back, his breath shallow, but then he heard the floor creak in the hallway. Slowly, he turned toward the sound. There, standing at the edge of the hallway, was a figure, just barely visible in the dim light of the kitchen. Its outline seemed to blur with the shadows. The figure stood still, as though waiting for him to notice. The air grew thick with tension, and Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. Just stood there. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure's presence was suffocating. He couldn't look away. Who? What is that? But as quickly as it appeared, the figure seemed to fade. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone like smoke evaporating into the air. Ethan blinked, his mind racing, his body frozen. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, utterly still, his breath shallow. His stomach twisted in knots, but all he could do was stare into the empty hallway. Was it real? A muffled knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Ethan's body jerked as he turned toward the front door. His hands were shaking, his mind unable to fully process what he had just seen or thought he had seen. He walked slowly to the door, each step echoing in the still apartment. He peered through the peephole, but no one was there. He opened the door cautiously, scanning the hallway. Nothing. That's it, he thought, swallowing hard. I'm losing it. The apartment was playing tricks on him. He'd heard stories of people losing their minds in places like this. Old buildings, strange noises, isolation, it had to be stress. It was all in his head. But as he closed the door, the whisper came again, clear and sharp, right behind him. Ethan. This time, there was no ignoring it. Ethan froze in place, every muscle in his body locking up at the sound of his name. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his breath was coming in shallow bursts. The whisper felt as if it was coming from inside his very skull, a quiet, insistent murmur that refused to be ignored. He spun around, his mind screaming at him to leave the apartment, to run, but there was no one there. The air in the room was still. The kitchen, once bustling with the sound of boiling. Pasta was eerily silent again. It felt as if the entire apartment had exhaled, and he was left standing in a vacuum of cold, stagnant air. His hand trembled as he reached for the kitchen light switch, flicking it on. The harsh light filled the room, casting long shadows along the walls. He glanced quickly around, but nothing seemed out of place. The whisper had stopped, at least for the moment, but the cold, heavy sensation remained, wrapping around him like a shroud. Just go to bed, he told himself. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe it's stress from the move. You're fine. But he wasn't fine. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a deep, gnawing sense that something was wrong. The apartment felt wrong. It wasn't the dusty old walls or the flickering lights. It was something more, a presence that wasn't his own, something watching him from the dark corners of the room, waiting. Ethan moved slowly toward the hallway, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. As he reached the threshold of the hall, the air grew colder again, the temperature dropping sharply as though the hallway itself were a separate world from the rest of the apartment. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes fixed on the open door of the second bedroom. The door to that room had been closed when he last looked, but now it was ajar again. Not wide, but enough to let the faintest sliver of light from the living room creep into the shadows beyond. His breath caught in his throat as he walked toward it. His fingers twitched at his sides, desperate to touch something solid, something real. He paused at the door, his pulse quickening with every passing second. He should close the door, lock it, pretend it was all just his imagination. But something pulled him forward, an invisible force urging him to look. He stepped inside. The room was as it had been before, empty, dusty, the air thick with the smell of disuse. But now it felt different. The walls seemed to loom closer, the shadows more oppressive. The bed, untouched, looked oddly inviting in its silence, as if it offered a refuge from the dread that clung to the apartment. Ethan glanced at the floor. The indentation was still there. A single, small depression in the dust where someone had clearly been standing for a long time. Ethan's breath caught again. The marks were subtle but unmistakable. Someone had stood there, hadn't they? He stepped closer, crouching down to examine the imprint more carefully. It was a perfect circular spot, just large enough to fit the shape of a person. His mind raced, the rational part of him screaming that this was impossible, but the sight of it was undeniable. The longer he stared, the more it seemed to pulse with a strange energy, almost as if it were waiting. Suddenly, the whisper returned. Only this time, it wasn't a murmur. It was louder, more distinct. His name again, Ethan, this time accompanied by a soft, slow scraping noise, like nails dragging across the wooden floor. Ethan whipped around, his eyes darting to the corners of the room. There was nothing there, just the shadows, stretching long and thin along the walls. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. The scraping sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. He couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the air thick with a presence that seemed to wrap around him like a tightening vice. His throat was dry, his head spinning. There was no escape from the oppressive weight of the apartment. His legs trembled beneath him as he backed toward the door, desperate to leave the room. But as he reached for the doorknob, a chill swept across his skin. The door slammed shut with a violent bang. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. He turned, but the room was silent again. The door had locked, and he was trapped inside. No. Panic gripped him, his mind spiraling. He could feel the walls pressing in, the floor beneath him seeming to tilt. He scrambled toward the window, but as he reached the frame, he saw it. The window was sealed shut. Not just closed, but locked tight. There was no escape. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood in the dark. His phone buzzed in his pocket. but he didn't move to check it. There was only the oppressive silence now, broken only by the faintest creak of the floorboards beneath him. He reached for his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he pulled it from his pocket. It was a message from Marcus. "You good, man? How's the place?" Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen, but before he could respond, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. The unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor. It was followed by the sound of something dragging, slow and deliberate, the scrape of furniture being moved across the floor. Ethan's blood ran cold. It was coming from the other room. He turned toward the hallway, his breath caught in his chest. He didn't know what to do, didn't know where to run. The apartment felt like it had shifted, like it wasn't just a building anymore, but a living thing. Something alive, something that could feel him. He took a hesitant step toward the hallway. And then, for the first time, the whisper wasn't alone. It was accompanied by a voice. A low, gravelly voice that spoke directly into his ear. "You're not supposed to be here." Ethan's blood ran cold as the world around him began to tremble. The floor beneath his feet seemed to sway, and the walls closed in like a vice. The voice came again, closer this time, the breath hot on his neck. "You disturbed it." The voice, deep and ragged, seemed to reverberate inside Ethan's skull, rattling his thoughts. His breath quickened, a sense of cold panic sinking deep into his chest. He spun around, but there was no one there, no sign of life in the room except for him. "Disturbed it," the voice repeated, slower this time, as though savoring each word. The room seemed to shift, like the walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with the slow, rhythmic exhalations of something unseen. Ethan's eyes darted from one corner of the room to the other, desperately searching for the source of the voice. His skin crawled, prickling with the feeling of invisible eyes watching him, closing in. The temperature had dropped. His breath came out in visible clouds, swirling in the frigid air around him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of the apartment, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. The words had struck something primal in him, a deep fear that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The whispering returned, now a chorus of voices, all murmuring at once. "You're not supposed to be here. It's awake." Ethan staggered backward, the voices pressing in on him from all directions. His chest tightened, suffocating under the weight of the unseen presence. He wanted to scream, to beg for this nightmare to end, but his throat was dry, words escaping him. Then, as suddenly as the voices had begun, they stopped. The silence was deafening. Ethan stood there, frozen, his eyes wide, his body trembling. The cold air still clung to him, the shadows stretching farther, deeper into the corners of the room. A loud crash from the hallway snapped him out of his trance. He spun toward the source of the sound, his heart hammering in his chest. Something or someone was in the hallway. Something large. Something heavy. Without thinking, Ethan rushed toward the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. He gripped the doorknob, but as he tried to turn it, he felt resistance. The door wouldn't budge. It was as if something was pressing against it from the other side, holding it shut. No, no, no. His mind screamed at him to break it open, but his hand was shaking too violently. He tried again, putting all his weight into it, but the door remained immovable. A soft, scraping sound grew louder. Something was dragging itself down the hallway. The noise was slow, deliberate, as though whatever it was had all the time in the world. Ethan's breathing grew shallow, his thoughts racing. The air was thick with dread, every corner of the apartment seemingly closing in on him. He could feel the presence getting closer, just beyond the door, just beyond his reach. The scraping sound came closer still, until it was almost right outside the door. With a final, desperate push, Ethan threw his shoulder into the door. It groaned in protest, but the lock clicked. He stumbled forward, bursting into the hallway. The hallway was dark, the shadows nearly swallowing the light from the living room. His eyes strained to see, but the darkness seemed impenetrable. There was no one there, no one visible, but something was moving in the darkness. Something was waiting. The scraping sound continued, now coupled with a low, guttural growl, like a wounded animal dragging itself across the floor. The sound was right behind him. Ethan spun around, his breath caught in his throat. And there it was. The figure, vague and shifting in the dim light, was standing at the end of the hallway. It wasn't human, not by any means. It was a mass of shadows, its form contorted and uneven, as though it was made from the darkness itself. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a faint, otherworldly light, their shape indescribable, like black holes sucking in the very light around them. The thing didn't move, but it didn't need to. The very presence of it made the walls tremble, the air growing colder still, until Ethan could feel the frost on his skin. It was watching him. Ethan's body screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. His chest tightened, panic creeping in like a poison. His mouth went dry, his hands trembling. "You've disturbed it." The voice came again, closer now, as though the thing were speaking directly into his ear. "It knows you're here now." The figure didn't move, but the air around it pulsed with malevolent energy. Ethan could feel it. It was like a living thing, breathing with the darkness, waiting for him to make a move. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sounds, until there was only the thudding of his pulse and the faint scraping sound that had never stopped. The walls shook again, louder this time. The sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floor came from behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing there. Only the figure, watching, waiting, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was closer. A shift in the air, a sudden lurch of motion, and the thing was right in front of him. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. The figure, no, whatever it was, reached out, its long, spindly limbs stretching toward him. Its fingers were like black claws, their tips tapering to sharp points, but before it could touch him, Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. He scrambled backward, his feet stumbling over the floor, his body jerking into motion. With every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan turned and bolted down the hallway. His feet slammed against the floor, each step reverberating in his chest, but he couldn't look back. Not yet. Not until he got to the door. The exit was close, just ahead. But as he reached the door, the temperature dropped once again. The whispers, no longer whispers, roared in his ears, deafening. His vision blurred, and the door seemed to stretch further away, as if it were mocking him. He couldn't escape. Not like this. The scraping sound was back, faster now, closing in on him. And then, a final whisper, loud and clear. "You're not leaving." Ethan's heart raced in his chest as the final whisper echoed in his ears, the words seeping into his very bones. "You're not leaving." The room seemed to close in around him, the walls constricting as though they were alive, bending and twisting under the weight of the thing that had been watching him. His eyes darted to the door again. It was right there, the exit, but every step he took toward it seemed to stretch further away, like a cruel illusion designed to keep him trapped. "Move, damn it!" His mind screamed at him, but his body felt heavy, sluggish, as if the very air was pressing down on him. Each step felt as though he were wading through water, the distance between him and freedom growing impossibly large. He could feel it. The thing behind him, the creature that had haunted the shadows, was closing in. Ethan pushed forward, forcing his legs to carry him despite the paralyzing fear flooding his veins. The scraping grew louder, faster, like claws dragging across the floor, coming from all directions now, as though the very apartment itself had turned against him. He reached the door, finally, and wrenched it open with all his strength. But as soon as the door cracked, something slammed into him, hard. He stumbled backward, falling to the floor, gasping for air, the breath knocked out of his lungs. No, 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 no. His vision swam as he scrambled to get up, but the air was too thick, suffocating. The scraping sound was everywhere now, too many sources to pinpoint, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was as though the whole building was alive, an endless, twisting maze of shifting shadows. And then he felt it, cold fingers on his ankle. The touch was so icy, so unnatural, that it sent a jolt of terror straight through his body. His skin prickled with the sensation of something unseen reaching for him. He yanked his foot free, kicking it away, but the air grew even colder, thick with dread. He had to move, or he would never leave this place. With every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan scrambled to his feet, his legs shaking as he stumbled toward the stairs, his mind racing. Get out, get out, get out. He barely made it to the landing before the scraping noise became deafening. The air grew so thick that it was hard to breathe, as though the apartment was sucking the life out of him. The figure was still there, standing just at the edge of his vision, flickering in and out of the shadows like a nightmare come to life. It was close, closer than before, and he could feel its presence as if it were standing directly behind him, breathing down his neck. His hand gripped the railing as he moved faster, his mind screaming for him to run, to escape. He reached the front door, his fingers fumbling for the handle, but the door wouldn't open. He jerked on it, desperate, the cold metal biting into his skin. And then, click, the door swung open. Ethan didn't hesitate. He rushed out into the hallway of the building, slamming the door behind him. He didn't care that it was pitch black, that the hall was silent and lifeless. All that mattered was getting away. He stumbled toward the stairs, his heart thundering in his chest, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. And then, from the darkness of the hallway, he heard it again, the whisper. "You can't leave. You disturbed it." The voice was right behind him, the sound of it scraping against his skin like nails on a chalkboard. He turned and saw it, a shadow, too dark for any light to penetrate, its form shifting and writhing, an abomination of darkness. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There was no more room to run. His back hit the wall of the stairwell, and he was trapped. The thing took a slow step toward him, its limbs stretching and snapping like bone, and sinew bending in unnatural angles. Its eyes, those dark, glowing holes, were fixed on him, pulling him in. He could feel it like a gravitational force, pulling at his very soul. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered again, and this time there was no mistaking the finality in the voice. "Now you will stay." Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears, the world around him spinning. But in that moment, he knew something had changed. He wasn't just scared anymore. He wasn't just trapped. He understood now. It wanted him. It had always wanted him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't some figment of his imagination. The apartment had been waiting for him, and now that he had crossed its threshold, there was no escaping it. The thing was right in front of him now, its jagged, malformed limbs reaching out, and Ethan could do nothing but stare into the abyss of those dark eyes. The world around him went black. The blackness was suffocating. Ethan's body felt weightless, like he was being pulled into a deep, endless void. His mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening, but the darkness was overwhelming, pulling him deeper, faster, until there was nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat, loud, thunderous, desperate. But then, just as suddenly as the darkness had enveloped him, a sharp, blinding light cut through it, and Ethan gasped for air. His lungs burned, as if he had been drowning, and his vision spun wildly before stabilizing. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of where he was. He was back in the apartment. The walls, the floor, everything was exactly as it had been before. The same dusty, faded furniture, the same yellowed curtains hanging limply by the window. The smell of stale air and old wood filled his nose. The light from the kitchen overhead flickered once, then stabilized. He was standing in the middle of the living room, his hands trembling at his sides, his breath still shallow. It was like nothing had changed, like he had never left, except for one thing. The feeling of it, the thing that had been chasing him, the one that had whispered his name and trapped him in the shadows, was still there. He could feel it lurking, waiting just beyond his vision, lurking in the corners of the apartment, watching him with those cold, empty eyes. His pulse quickened as the door to the second bedroom slowly creaked open by itself. The light in the hallway was dim, casting strange shadows that seemed to twist and stretch as though they had a life of their own. Something was in that room. He could feel it. It was calling to him. No, Ethan thought, shaking his head, his breath catching in his throat. No. He had to leave. He had to get out before it was too late. But as he moved toward the door, something stopped him. A faint noise, a whisper of fabric shifting, a breath soft, slow, and deliberate. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was behind him. He spun around, eyes wide, heart hammering in his chest, but the living room was empty. Or so it seemed. The shadows had thickened. They had become more defined, as if the darkness itself were alive and growing in the corners, reaching toward him like hands, long and spindly, fingers outstretched. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing just inside the hallway. It was vague at first, a dark silhouette, but as his gaze focused, he could see it clearer. It was him, a twisted version of himself, standing motionless in the shadows. Its face was a distorted, empty mask, its features elongated and grotesque. The eyes, those same dark, glowing eyes, were wide open, locked onto him, staring through him into his very soul. Ethan's breath hitched. He stumbled backward, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just a trick of the light. This thing, this creature, was him, or at least a version of him. A wrong version. The figure raised its hand slowly, its fingers twisting unnaturally, and pointed directly at him. The air grew heavy again, thick with an oppressive force, like gravity itself had doubled. The whispers filled his ears, louder now, a chorus of voices, all chanting his name in that eerie, hollow tone. Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. The walls trembled. The shadows swirled, closing in. The thing in the hallway moved, stepping out from the darkness with a slow, deliberate pace, its form shifting and contorting with every step. The ground beneath Ethan's feet began to tremble, and he realized, with horror, that he was no longer in control of his own body. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. He was frozen, rooted to the spot. No, please, please. His thoughts were fragmented, his mind unraveling with terror. But just before the creature could reach him, there was a loud crack. The apartment walls seemed to buckle inward, groaning with an unnatural force, and the floor beneath Ethan's feet splintered. A burst of white-hot light blinded him, and the world around him shattered. The air was thick with a soundless roar, a pressure that seemed to crush him from all sides, and the light pulled him in, drawing him toward it with an irresistible force. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the immense weight of the darkness. His body, his mind, everything was being torn apart, ripped into nothingness. And then, as if all of existence itself had collapsed, everything went silent. For a long moment, Ethan didn't know if he was still alive. He didn't know if he had even survived. But then, the silence was broken by a soft, familiar voice. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan's eyes fluttered open, his body heavy and aching. The air was cold, biting at his skin, but the apartment was gone. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all had vanished. He was standing in a vast, empty void, suspended in nothingness. There were no walls, no furniture, no sound, except for the voice echoing from nowhere. His heart hammered in his chest, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. "You disturbed it," the voice repeated. It was the same whisper he had heard all along, but this time it was clearer, sharper. It wasn't coming from the apartment anymore. It was coming from the space around him, the void. And then, from the endless blackness, something moved. A figure twisted in instinct began to take shape in the darkness. At first, it was nothing more than a shifting shadow, but as it grew closer, Ethan could see it, the creature. The same thing that had haunted the apartment, the thing that had waited for him. And this time, it wasn't in the shadows. It was standing in front of him, fully formed, its form towering over him. Its eyes were still dark, unblinking, glowing with an ancient, malevolent hunger. It smiled. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the creature's smile stretched wider, its jagged teeth gleaming like broken shards of glass. He tried to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around him was paralyzing him, locking him in place. The creature stepped forward, its presence oppressive, suffocating. With each step it took, the darkness around Ethan seemed to deepen, swallowing up whatever little light there was left. The temperature plummeted, a biting cold that sank into his bones, making it feel like the very essence of life was being drained from him. "You don't understand," the creature rasped, its voice low and gurgling, like a whisper carried on the wind of a distant storm. "You shouldn't have come. You never should have come here. This place, it's a prison, and you're part of it now." Ethan's breath hitched. His mind scrambled to process what the creature was saying. "Prison? What do you mean?" His voice was caught in his throat. His mouth was dry, his tongue thick with terror, but the creature didn't need to hear him speak. It could read his fear, his confusion. The creature tilted its head, its grotesque eyes narrowing. "This apartment, this world, it's a cage, but not just for you, for all of them. All the souls who were foolish enough to step inside, trapped, bound by their own curiosity, and by the thing you disturbed." Ethan tried to move again, but the darkness around him seemed to grow tighter, pressing in on him from all sides, suffocating him with its weight. "Do you feel it?" The creature's voice growled, now almost a guttural hiss. "The pulling, the force drawing you in, the thing you awakened is coming. It knows you, Ethan. It knows you better than you know yourself. And when it comes..." The creature's smile widened, showing rows of sharp, serrated teeth. "You'll never leave." A cold sweat broke out across Ethan's forehead as the gravity of the words settled in. This place, the apartment, it wasn't just a haunted building. It was a prison, a place for the lost, the forgotten, the souls who had made the mistake of stepping through its door. And the creature in front of him wasn't its true form. It was a guardian, a warden of sorts, a servant to the malevolent force that lived beneath the walls, beneath the very foundation of the building. The realization hit him like a slap. The thing he had disturbed. It was alive, and it wasn't going to let him go. Not now. Not ever. The creature took another step forward, its shadow stretching, wrapping around Ethan like chains. It moved in closer, its breath foul and cold, swirling around Ethan's face. "It's already too late," it murmured, its voice now barely a whisper in his ear. "You're already part of it, and soon you'll be like the others, forgotten, lost, a part of the darkness that you can never escape from." Ethan closed his eyes, fighting the wave of hopelessness that crashed over him. His heart screamed in protest, but his body refused to move. His mind spun, the thoughts crashing together, the terror too much to bear. But then, something inside him, something primal, something deep, snapped. "No!" Ethan's eyes shot open, his body surging with adrenaline. He could feel it now, something shifting inside him. He had been afraid, yes, but he had been more than that. He had been trapped by his fear, trapped by his own doubt. But no more. In that instant, a flash of clarity flooded his mind. He had a choice. The creature loomed closer, its claws stretching toward him, its grin wide and expectant. But Ethan took a deep, shaky breath, forcing himself to move, to push through the crushing weight of the darkness. He took a step back, then another, and another. And with each step, the creature seemed to falter, its smile faltering for the first time. The darkness around him rippled, the air seeming to shift like the hold it had on him was beginning to loosen. "You can't run," the creature hissed, its voice a low growl. "There's nowhere to go. You're already here, trapped in the void. You'll never escape. Never." But Ethan didn't stop. His mind raced as he stumbled backward, his hands reaching out, grasping for anything. The darkness was no longer suffocating him. It was changing, bending to his will, as if his defiance, his resistance, was a force it couldn't contain. The walls of the void seemed to distort, flickering, as though reality itself was unraveling. The creature's form shifted, growing larger, its features warping, but Ethan kept his focus. He had to escape. He had to break free. Then, with a deafening crack, the void around him began to crack open, the darkness splintering like glass. "No!" The creature's voice screeched, raw and panicked, as if it could feel its power slipping away. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pressed forward, eyes locked on the rip in the void, the crack in reality itself. His chest ached with effort, but the closer he got to the opening, the weaker the creature became, its form flickering and distorting with each passing second. The light from the rift pulled him in, and with a final, desperate push, Ethan surged through the crack. And then, everything went white. When the light receded, Ethan found himself standing in the middle of a street. The air was warm. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow over the world around him. He blinked, his mind reeling from what had just happened. Was this real? Had it all been some kind of nightmare? But then, as he looked around, he noticed something strange. The street was quiet. The buildings were old, abandoned, their windows shattered. There was no sound, no movement. It was like a ghost town. A shadow passed over him. Ethan turned around, his heart skipping a beat. And there, standing in the distance, just at the edge of the street, was the figure. The creature. Its eyes locked onto him, glowing in the darkening light. "You can never escape, Ethan," it whispered, its voice carrying across the empty street. "You disturbed it, and now you will always be part of it." Ethan's heart sank as the darkness stretched out behind him, swallowing the street whole. Ethan's pulse raced as he turned away from the creature, his breath shallow and frantic. The street around him seemed to distort, the buildings shifting and warping in his peripheral vision. The air, once warm and familiar, now felt thick, suffocating. He could feel it, the pull, the tug, the weight of the darkness behind him creeping closer. It's not real, he thought, his mind desperately clinging to the belief that he hadn't really escaped. This isn't real. It's just another trick. But the creature's voice, that low, mocking whisper, pierced through his thoughts. "You can't run. You can't hide. It's always there, Ethan. Always." He glanced over his shoulder, but the creature was no longer standing in the street. Instead, its form flickered in and out of the shadows, growing larger with each blink, its eyes glowing a menacing yellow that reflected the fading sunlight. The smile, the same jagged, twisted grin, spread wider, and Ethan could feel it sinking into him, deep into his bones. He took a shaky step forward, then another. His legs were unsteady, as if the ground beneath him was shifting, unstable. His thoughts were frantic, spiraling. "I have to get away. I have to get out of here." But no matter how fast he moved, the streets remained the same, endless, stretching out in every direction, barren and desolate. There was no sign of life, no other people, just the same cracked buildings and empty, lifeless roads. "It's like a loop," he realized, a sense of dread settling over him like a heavy cloak. "I'm stuck. I'm trapped here." With every step, the shadows seemed to lengthen, growing more pronounced. The light was fading faster now, the once soft, golden glow of the sunset giving way to an oppressive, cold twilight. The temperature dropped, and the silence in the air felt like a suffocating weight pressing against his chest. Then, as if summoned by his thoughts, the whisper returned. "You can't escape, Ethan. You disturbed it, and now it will come for you. Forever." Ethan's mind reeled, the horror of the situation sinking in deeper. He was no longer sure if he was still in the same reality, or if he had fallen into something far worse. He had felt the rift, the crack in reality when he had broken through, but now, nothing felt real. The streets seemed to stretch on forever, twisting in ways that defied logic, and no matter how much he ran, the creature remained. It was always just behind him, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive, like a dark shadow creeping closer with every breath. The world around him began to blur, the lines between reality and nightmare dissolving. His body felt like it was moving through molasses, slow and heavy, as if every step was being dragged down by invisible forces. The streetlights overhead flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced like ghosts. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet cracked. The concrete split, sending a sharp, deafening sound through the air, like the sound of bones snapping. Ethan stumbled, his hands reaching out to catch himself, but there was nothing solid to grab. The earth was breaking apart, disintegrating into blackness. No. The fear flooded him like a tidal wave, his body trembling uncontrollably. He could feel the ground crumbling away beneath him, the darkness rising up from the cracks, swallowing everything in its path. The creature's whisper grew louder, more frantic. "It's coming." The words echoed, reverberating through his skull like a death sentence. Ethan's chest tightened. His breathing grew erratic as he stumbled backward, his eyes frantically scanning for an escape, for anything, but there was nothing, just the endless darkness that loomed closer with every passing second. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A doorway. At first, it was just a flicker, a faint light breaking through the inky blackness, but as he moved toward it, it grew clearer, more distinct. A door, glowing faintly in the void, with light spilling out from the edges, offering a glimpse of something. Real. Ethan's heart surged in his chest as he rushed toward it, his legs moving faster than he thought possible. The creature's voice fading into the background as his focus narrowed onto the doorway. If I could just reach it. He was almost there, only a few steps away, when the ground beneath him gave way entirely. The concrete shattered into jagged pieces, and he plummeted into the abyss. His body fell, falling faster and faster, the air whipping around him as his mind screamed in terror. The world twisted, turned, and then darkness. But just as he thought he was lost forever, the fall stopped. A sudden jolt, and Ethan found himself standing again, disoriented, dizzy, and gasping for air. He was back in the apartment. But this time, everything was different. The air was thick, suffocating, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The room had shifted somehow, warped, as if the very fabric of the place was alive, breathing, watching him. The familiar yellowed curtains hung limp, the dusty furniture still arranged in the same way, but everything felt off. It's not real. The words echoed in his mind, but this time they came with a sense of finality. Ethan turned slowly, dread sinking into his stomach, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The whispers were back, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. He could hear them now, seeping from every crack in the walls, from every shadow, crawling into his ears like insects. The creature wasn't in front of him, but he could feel its presence, like a cold hand resting on the back of his neck. He knew, deep down, that it was watching him, waiting. And this time, he wasn't sure if he could escape again. The door behind him creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the creature. Its eyes burned with an unholy light. Its form shifted and writhed, like it was made of shadows and smoke, impossibly large, impossibly close. "You will never leave," it said, its voice a harsh rasp, the words scraping against his skin. "You belong here now, and soon you will understand." Ethan's vision blurred, his mind fracturing as the creature's laughter echoed in his ears. It was right. There was no escaping. He had disturbed it, and now there was no going back. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs as the creature's words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. It was impossible to think, impossible to breathe. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, the walls pressing inward as the creature's form seemed to fill every corner of the apartment. The air was heavy with a bitter, metallic smell like rust and decay. The shadows that clung to the walls twisted, stretching toward him as if they had a mind of their own. His eyes darted around the room, but there was no escape, no exit. The door behind him had vanished, leaving only the oppressive darkness that surrounded him. The creature stepped forward, each movement deliberate, its eyes glowing with malevolent intensity. Ethan could feel the weight of its gaze pressing against him, crawling beneath his skin, tearing at his sanity. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around him had become thick, a prison of its own. "There's no point in fighting, Ethan," the creature whispered, its voice slithering into his ears, wrapping around his thoughts. "You're already mine. Your struggle, your resistance, it only makes it worse." Ethan's breath quickened. No, I won't give up. I won't let this thing win." But even as he thought it, his resolve began to weaken. His body felt heavier, as if it was sinking into the floor, becoming a part of the very darkness that surrounded him. He tried to move, to step back, but his legs were like lead. The creature's laughter filled the room, a low, guttural sound that made Ethan's skin crawl. "I can feel your fear, your desperation," it hissed. "It's all I need to feed. The more you resist, the more you give me. Your soul, your memories, your essence, they're all mine now." The walls began to pulse, the room alive with an unnatural rhythm. The shadows seemed to vibrate, writhing with an energy that was both ancient and terrifying. Ethan could feel them reaching for him, pulling at his limbs, tugging him closer to the creature, to the inevitable fate that awaited him. In the corner of his vision, he saw a faint flicker, a small, fragile light. It was dim, like a dying ember, but it was something. Something that wasn't the creature. Something that wasn't this nightmare. Without thinking, without fully understanding why, Ethan lunged toward it. The shadows seemed to fight against him, wrapping around his arms, his legs, pulling him back, but he fought with everything he had. He had to reach the light. It was the only chance. His hand brushed against something solid, something real, and he grabbed onto it with all his strength. He didn't know what it was, but he didn't care. The light flickered again, brighter this time, a beacon in the darkness. The creature roared in fury, its form shifting and distorting as if it were losing its grip on reality. Ethan could hear the distortion in its voice as it screamed his name, the syllables stretching and warping in ways that didn't seem possible. "You cannot escape me." But Ethan was already pulling himself through the light, through the crack in the darkness that had appeared. It was like pushing through a thin veil, a barrier that had once seemed unbreakable. With a final, desperate push, he broke through. The world around him shifted violently, the oppressive weight of the creature's presence dissolving as he fell into a new reality. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the apartment. He was standing in a different place altogether, a forest. The air was fresh, the earth beneath his feet solid, grounding him in this new world. The trees stretched high into the sky, their branches swaying gently in the wind. But even as the beauty of the forest settled around him, a dark, gnawing feeling remained. Was this real? He looked around, disoriented, still shaken by the experience he had just gone through. The whispers had stopped, but the heavy feeling in his chest remained. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched, that something was still there, lurking just out of sight. "Not real," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. "It's not real. I'm free. I'm safe." But as the words left his mouth, the ground beneath him trembled. A shadow moved in the distance, darting between the trees like a living thing. And then, far off in the woods, he saw it again, the creature. Its eyes glowed faintly, the shape flickering like a mirage in the trees. It wasn't just in the forest, it was the forest. The very ground, the air, the trees themselves, everything was infected with its presence. It's still here. The realization hit Ethan like a physical blow. There was no escaping. The creature had followed him, no matter where he went. It was everywhere, always. The trees began to twist, their trunks warping into grotesque, unnatural shapes, their branches growing longer, more menacing. The earth beneath his feet cracked open, revealing deep, endless darkness, and the very sky above seemed to darken with an oppressive weight. And then, through the twisted trees, Ethan heard the voice again. "You can't escape, Ethan." His blood turned cold as he turned to face the sound. There, standing at the edge of the forest, the creature loomed, its massive form twisting and contorting with every movement, its glowing eyes fixed on him. A cold, sick smile spread across its face. "You'll never escape, Ethan," it repeated, its voice echoing through the woods, a final, terrible promise. "You are mine, and I will never let you go." Ethan stood frozen in place, the chilling voice of the creature reverberating in his skull like a deep, echoing drumbeat. His breath caught in his throat, panic setting in. The forest had grown even darker now, the trees looming like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky, the air thick and oppressive. The ground beneath his feet pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as though it was alive, breathing, waiting. He turned slowly, his gaze still locked on the creature, but it had changed. It wasn't standing at the edge of the forest anymore. It was closer, far too close, its shape shifting and distorting with every heartbeat. The shadows around it seemed to bend and twist, warping the very air itself. The creature's smile grew wider, impossibly wide, its jagged teeth gleaming like broken glass. Its eyes were pure, glowing darkness, and they locked onto Ethan with a predatory intensity that made his stomach churn. "You can never leave." The words slipped from the creature's lips like poison, smooth and insidious, wrapping around his mind. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest, every fiber of his being screaming for him to run, but his legs felt as if they were made of stone. It was as if the very ground was pulling him down, holding him in place. Escape. I have to escape. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to hide. The forest, the world around him, began to blur again, shifting, collapsing, as if it were losing its shape, its substance. The darkness was spreading, crawling along the edges of his vision, swallowing the forest whole. The creature's presence grew more powerful with each passing moment, pushing it on him from all sides, suffocating him with its unnatural, malicious energy. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again, the faintest flicker of light, like a distant star just beyond reach. This time, he didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He just ran. His feet tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at his face, the thick shadows seeming to reach for him. But he pushed forward, driven by a single, desperate hope. The light was still there, faint but persistent, and he had to reach it. The ground beneath him shifted once more, and the trees seemed to close in around him. It felt like the forest itself was alive, trying to trap him, to keep him from reaching that fragile beacon of hope. But Ethan didn't stop. He pushed forward, faster now, his pulse roaring in his ears, every step a fight against the crushing darkness. The light grew brighter with each passing moment, until finally, with one last burst of effort, Ethan broke through. The world shifted again, the oppressive dark forest falling away, the light enveloping him. But when the light faded, it wasn't the peaceful forest that greeted him. Ethan gasped in horror as he found himself standing in a vast, empty space. The floor beneath him was black and cracked, stretching out into infinity. There was no sky, no trees, just a void, an endless abyss that yawned open around him, cold and oppressive. His breath caught in his throat as he spun in place, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The only thing that stood out in this blackened world was a single figure standing in the distance. The creature. It was no longer a shapeless mass of shadows, but something more defined, more real. It stood there, its form humanoid now, but twisted and grotesque, the same jagged smile stretching across its face, its eyes burning with an inhuman glow. "Welcome to the end, Ethan." The voice sent a jolt of terror through him, and for the first time, he truly understood the depths of his nightmare. This wasn't a forest. This wasn't a trick. This was it. The final place. The place he had been pulled into. The creature began to move toward him, its form rippling and shifting with each step, as if it were made of smoke, of shadows, of something beyond the physical world. Every movement it made distorted reality around it, making the world crack and warp as if it were too fragile to hold its shape. Ethan's body trembled, his legs barely holding him upright as he stumbled back. The ground beneath him quaked. It felt as though the very fabric of existence was being torn apart. He had no words left, no will to fight. But the creature's voice continued, a cold whisper that wrapped itself around his mind. "You can't run. You can't hide. There's nowhere to go. You belong to me, Ethan. Forever." It stepped closer, its face now mere inches from his, the dark, soulless eyes gleaming like the void itself. And then, in the blink of an eye, the creature opened its mouth wide, too wide, its jagged teeth glistening with a sickly sheen. "You're mine," it whispered, its voice an agonizing rasp that tore through his mind. Ethan gasped, his chest tight, and he tried to turn, to flee, but it was too late. His feet were rooted to the cracked black ground, unable to move, unable to escape. He could feel the darkness, the weight of the creature's power, pushing in on him from all sides. It was consuming him. As the creature's teeth sank into his skin, an unbearable, burning pain flooded his body, spreading like fire through his veins. The darkness rushed in, swallowing everything, the light, the sound, the very sense of self. Everything faded until all that remained was the emptiness. In the endless void, the creature's laughter echoed, loud and triumphant, as it consumed Ethan's soul, trapping him in a place where time no longer existed. And as it faded into the infinite darkness, the last whisper of Ethan's mind screamed in silence. There was no escape. The void was cold, a chilling emptiness that stretched on forever. Ethan's mind, consumed by the darkness, was nothing more than a whisper of a thought, a flickering light in an ocean of black. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even feel his own heartbeat. Time itself had lost all meaning, twisted and fractured by the creature's presence. His body, or what was left of it, was lost in the abyss, his soul drawn into the infinite night where everything existed and nothing existed at once. Then, something strange happened. A faint pulse, a heartbeat, just the barest rhythm of life, echoed through the void. At first, Ethan thought it was a memory, some fragment of his past, but the pulse grew stronger, clearer, almost tangible. It beat like a drum, reverberating through the blackness, cutting through the suffocating silence. It was hope. Is this real? Ethan thought, though he had no voice to speak, no body to move. Am I still alive? With the pulse came something else, a sound. It was a voice, faint but growing louder, though it wasn't the creature's. It was a voice he recognized, one that had once filled the halls of his home, a voice that had been lost in the noise of his mind. Don't let it win. It was his mother's voice. Ethan tried to focus, tried to hold on to that voice, but it was slipping away again, fading like a dream. But then the pulse returned, stronger this time. He wasn't sure what it was, where it was coming from, but it felt like a thread, a lifeline pulling him back. The darkness began to shift. The empty void quivered as if the universe itself was fracturing, breaking apart. The space around Ethan began to bend, the edges of the darkness curling, warping into something more tangible, more real. A faint light began to break through the cracks, a flicker, like a distant star that had suddenly caught fire. The creature was still there, its presence like a looming shadow in the distance, watching, waiting, its voice echoing like a distant thunderstorm. But something had changed. The suffocating weight of the creature's power had weakened, the force of its presence less oppressive, as though the very fabric of the void was fighting against it. Suddenly, Ethan felt something. The sensation of touch. The sharp bite of cold air against the skin. His hands, stiff and heavy at first, slowly began to move. He could feel them. His fingers curled into fists the ground beneath. Him solidifying as he pushed himself up. He was back. He wasn't trapped anymore. The cold, agonizing emptiness that had consumed him was receding, replaced by the familiar weight of the earth beneath his feet. Where am I? He opened his eyes, or at least he thought he did. The world around him was blurry at first, shifting in and out of focus like a dream. The light was still faint, a soft glow against the endless dark, but it was growing stronger, becoming more defined. He could make out shapes now, trees, a sky. He couldn't tell, but he could feel it. He was no longer in the void. Ethan staggered to his feet, his legs shaky, as if he were standing for the first time. The ground beneath him felt solid, the cool touch of grass brushing against his skin, the faint rustle of wind through the air. It felt real. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world around him felt real. And yet, something was wrong. The trees surrounding him were twisted, their branches gnarled and distorted, their trunks cracked and splintered as if they had been burned and twisted by some unseen force. The sky overhead was a sickly shade of green, an unnatural color that seemed to pulse with energy. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows in the distance stretched unnaturally long, as though the very light was being pulled toward them. He heard the voice again, this time clearer, more distinct. You can't outrun it, Ethan. It will always find you. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that voice. The creature was here, in this twisted world. It had followed him, no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran. Panic surged in his chest, but this time, something else surged alongside it. A deep, primal anger. He wasn't going to let it take him again. He couldn't. He wouldn't. You don't control me, he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking aloud or if it was just a thought. The words felt powerful, like a defiant spark in the midst of storm. The creature's laugh, a low, terrifying sound, rolled through the air, shaking the ground beneath him. You think you have a choice? You never did. You never will. But Ethan didn't care anymore. He clenched his fists, his body trembling with the force of his resolve. Suddenly, the pulse, the light, everything flared around him. It wasn't just the world warping anymore. He was the light. His very being pulsed with it, radiated it, filled the void that had. Consumed him with a brightness so intense it could burn the shadows away. He could feel his energy crackling like electricity in his veins. He was not the prey. He was the hunter. The creature screeched, the sound piercing, filled with fury. No, you are mine. But Ethan could feel it now. The creature's power was waning. The void was shrinking. The forest around him, though twisted and dark, was pushing back against the shadows, growing stronger, more defined. The light in his chest flared once more, and Ethan reached out with everything he had. The pulse of light surged through his arms, his fingertips crackling with power. The creature howled in agony as the light consumed it, its form flickering, distorting, unraveling like a thread being pulled apart. It shrieked once more, a horrific sound that reverberated through the air before it vanished entirely. The world went silent. Ethan stood, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with each frantic breath. The ground beneath his feet was still firm, the forest still twisted, but it was quieter now. More still. The oppressive weight of the creature's presence had lifted. He was free. Or was he? His heart skipped as he glanced around, unsure whether this world was the real one or just another trap. The light pulsed weakly, then brighter again, but Ethan wasn't sure how long it would last. And somewhere in the distance, the whisper returned. "You can't outrun me." The words echoed in his mind, sending a shiver down his spine. Ethan's body tensed, the pulse of light still radiating from him. Yet his mind couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The voice that echoed in the distance was chilling, almost comforting in its certainty. "You can't outrun me." It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a promise, a whisper of doom that would forever haunt him. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their twisted branches creaking like ancient bones, but even the wind felt wrong. The very air around him seemed to press down on him, as if the forest itself was aware of his presence, watching him, waiting. Ethan turned in place, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. The light that had been pulsing from him, the last trace of hope he clung to, began to fade. Not completely, but just enough to make the world around him seem darker. The shadows stretched longer, the corners of his vision bending and warping, and he could almost hear the pulse of the forest itself, the heartbeats of a world trapped in its own nightmare. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but as the eerie silence stretched on, he began to feel it again, the presence. The feeling that he was being watched, that every tree, every shadow was closing in on him. It's still here. It's never really gone. The realization hit him like a cold gust of wind. The creature hadn't just disappeared. It had shifted, morphed, found another way to latch onto him. This world, the one he thought was free of it, was another trap, a different kind of prison. No, I won't let it win. With a deep breath, Ethan steadied himself. His mind raced, thoughts crashing against one another like waves on jagged rocks. He wasn't sure how long he had before the creature found him again, but he needed to act fast. The pulse of light, faint as it was still his only weapon. He focused on it, willing it to grow stronger, to burn brighter. The world around him responded, the trees creaking louder, the shadows pushing back against the light. For a brief moment, the pulse of light expanded, illuminating the twisted landscape in an almost blinding brilliance. But then it flickered. A sharp, crackling sound split the air. Ethan's eyes snapped to the source of the disturbance, an unnatural crack in the earth, jagged and wide, stretching across the forest floor. From within the crack, tendrils of darkness began to seep out, thick and writhing, curling like serpents. His heart skipped a beat. The creature's power was still here. He backed away slowly, but the ground trembled beneath his feet, as if the very earth was alive and responding to the creature's summons. The dark tendrils snaked closer, reaching for him, and Ethan could feel the oppressive weight of their presence. The shadows had grown stronger, darker, and even the light within him felt feeble in comparison. Then, from a fissure in the earth, the creature's voice emerged once more. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a roar, loud and filled with rage. "You can't escape. You can't hide. You're mine, Ethan, forever." The ground beneath Ethan's feet split open wider, and the dark tendrils surged forward, wrapping around his legs, pulling at him, dragging him toward the fissure. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow. His light, though still burning inside him, flickered weakly, too weakly. This isn't enough, he thought, panic surging through him. "I can't stop it." The darkness closed in, the tendrils wrapping around his arms, his waist, constricting tighter with each passing second. He fought against them, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, too many. The light within him, his only hope, was fading. As the darkness pulled him deeper into the crack, his mind screamed, "I can't let it take me. Not again. I won't be its prisoner." And then, just as he felt himself being consumed by the dark, a single, fleeting thought cut through the haze of terror. What if I'm not meant to escape? It wasn't a comforting thought. It wasn't a thought born of acceptance or surrender. But it was a thought that sparked something deep within him, an awareness, a realization. The creature had been hunting him, pulling him into its grasp again and again. Not because it wanted him, but because he was something it feared. Maybe I'm not the prey. The thought surged within him like a tidal wave, and suddenly, with an intense burst of will, Ethan forced the light inside him to burn brighter. He didn't try to escape anymore. He didn't run. Instead, he channeled everything he had into the light, letting it flood his body, his mind, his very soul. The darkness recoiled. The tendrils shrieked, twisting violently as the light seared them, burning them away, one by one. Ethan's body trembled with the force of the power coursing through him, his pulse syncing with the rhythm of the light that now consumed him whole. The world around him seemed to bend and snap, the shadows warping, twisting like they were being torn apart by some unseen force. And then, with an ear-splitting crack, the world split open. The darkness howled, its voice raw with rage and frustration, but it was too late. The light had grown too powerful, too consuming. The fissure in the earth collapsed, the tendrils vanishing into the air, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. For a moment, everything was still. Ethan stood in the center of it all, panting heavily, his heart racing, his body spent. But something had changed. The forest around him, though still dark and twisted, was different. The oppressive weight of the creature had lifted. The trees, though gnarled and misshapen, were still trees. The sky, though unnatural, was still sky. The world felt more solid, more real. For the first time, Ethan realized the truth. The creature didn't control the world. The creature didn't create it. This place, the forest, the void, it had all been a test, a challenge. And now Ethan understood. He had passed it. But even as the last tendrils of darkness faded, the creature's voice echoed one final time, its words a cold reminder. "You are mine, and I will never stop hunting you." Ethan stood tall, unshaken, the light still pulsing within him. He wasn't sure where he was or what was coming next. But one thing was certain. He would no longer run. This time he would fight, and he would never stop fighting until the darkness was truly gone. The air around Ethan felt thick, like the last remnants of the creature's malevolent presence were clinging to the very atmosphere. The forest, still twisted and warped, seemed to breathe, alive, but in an unnatural way. The trees groaned in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones, and the ground beneath his feet pulsed with an ominous rhythm. Despite the light still glowing faintly within him, the world around him had not returned to its natural state. It was as if the creature's grip on this place had been broken, but only just. The scars of its presence lingered, a reminder of the battle that had just been fought. Ethan steadied his breath, his body still trembling from the intensity of the light he had summoned, from the struggle that had nearly consumed him. His fists were clenched at his sides, his skin still tingling with the residue of power that had burned away the darkness. But he knew this wasn't over. The creature's words haunted him, echoing through his mind. "You are mine, and I will never stop hunting you." He didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew it was true. The creature wasn't just some force of nature. It was an ancient, relentless entity, one that fed on fear, on power, on control. And Ethan had only managed to escape its grasp for now. But it would never stop. It couldn't. A shiver ran down his spine, but he didn't allow himself to falter. He couldn't. His mind sharpened. He had to focus. There was still something he had to do. He had to find a way to stop this, to rid the world of the creature for good. He had to find a source. The light within him flared, a steady, rhythmic pulse, a silent promise to himself. I will fight. I will win. He began to move, his legs heavy at first, the weight of his thoughts dragging him down, but he forced himself forward. The forest, despite its warped and twisted appearance, was still a path. There were still signs, subtle clues, guiding him. If the creature had once controlled this place, perhaps there were remnants of its power here, hidden in the deepest parts of the forest, where it had first risen. He wasn't sure how long he walked, the path winding through the trees like some strange labyrinth. Each step felt like it took him deeper into the heart of this nightmare, further away from any chance of escape. The shadows shifted as he moved, warping around him, responding to his presence. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like an omen, a whisper that the creature was near, watching him. But Ethan pressed on, driven by that single, unyielding thought, I will not be its prey. The world seemed to close in around him, the forest stretching into infinity. Time became a blur, his steps mechanical as he followed the subtle trail through the darkness. It felt like the forest was breathing around him, alive in ways that defied logic, and the closer he came to the center, the more oppressive the weight became. Then, just as he thought he could go no further, he saw it. A clearing. The air in the clearing felt different, thicker, more charged. The trees surrounding it were even more twisted, their branches like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky, and in the center of the clearing stood a massive stone altar, ancient and weathered. The stones around it were covered in strange markings, symbols that made his skin crawl, pulsing with a faint, otherworldly glow. The altar itself was cracked, as though it had been split open by some tremendous force. Ethan approached it cautiously, feeling the weight of the power radiating from the altar, his heartbeat quickening in response to it. The air here was thick, like the very ground beneath him was steeped in the essence of the creature. This was where it had been summoned. This was its birthplace. As he stepped into the center of the clearing, the shadows around him deepened, stretching like long fingers across the ground. The creature's presence was suddenly overwhelming, a suffocating pressure that pressed against his chest, urging him to flee, to run back into the relative safety of the distorted forest. But he couldn't. Not again. Ethan knelt before the altar, his fingers brushing the strange symbols carved into the stone. They were cold to the touch, like the stone was alive, and yet there was something more. Something darker. He whispered to himself, more of a prayer than a command. I need to understand. Suddenly, the world shifted. A surge of dark energy erupted from the altar, and the stone beneath his fingers cracked open, revealing an ancient, pulsing heart, a heart of darkness, beating like the pulse of the creature itself. The air grew colder, the light from his body dimming in the presence of this unholy thing. The shadows around the altar seemed to come alive, swirling and writhing, converging on him, enveloping him. And then, out of the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't the creature, at least not entirely. It was something else, something just as ancient, just as terrifying. The figure was humanoid, but its features were obscured by a shroud of shifting shadows. Its eyes burned like molten lava, and its smile, oh, that smile was wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. You found it, it said, its voice like the cracking of ice. The source. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just the creature he had been running from. It was something else. Something older. Something more powerful. I don't know what you are, Ethan said, his voice trembling but firm, but I will end this. The figure's laugh was cold, devoid of warmth. You cannot end what has already been. This is the beginning, Ethan, not the end. The shadows closed in on him, but Ethan's heart raced with purpose, a new understanding rising within him. The creature, the entity that had haunted him, was not merely a force to be defeated. It was part of something far bigger, a greater darkness that had seeped into the world long before he had ever encountered it. And in that moment, Ethan realized the truth. he wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the world itself. But how? How could he defeat something so ancient, so entrenched in the fabric of reality? The figure leaned closer, its voice dripping with malice. "You'll try, but in the end, you are nothing but a pawn in the game." The shadows surged, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt himself falter, his resolve weakening. But then, the light inside him flared once more, stronger, brighter than ever before. This was it, the final confrontation, and Ethan was not going to let the darkness win. The shadows around Ethan surged, enveloping him, but this time he didn't flinch. The light within him, though small, flared with a fierce intensity, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. His breath steadied as he focused on the beating heart beneath the altar, the source of all the malevolent power that had haunted him. The figure before him, the dark, shrouded entity, was just another obstacle in the way, another puzzle piece of the creature's greater plan. But Ethan wasn't going to let it control him anymore. The figure's molten eyes flickered with amusement as it watched Ethan struggle against the darkness. "You think you can defeat me? You think you can stop what has already been set in motion? The creature you fear is nothing. I am the foundation, the origin. You're not even fighting me, Ethan. You're fighting your own mind, your own fears." Ethan gritted his teeth, his pulse quickening. The figure's words struck a chord, a nagging truth he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. It wasn't just the creature that he was battling. It was his own fear, his guilt, his failure. He had allowed himself to be consumed by the shadows for so long that he no longer knew where the creature ended and his own thoughts began. But the moment of doubt passed quickly. He could feel the energy of the light inside him, warmer now, stronger than it had ever been. The battle wasn't just about survival. It wasn't even just about defeating the creature. It was about reclaiming himself. With that thought, Ethan's chest swelled with power. The light pulsing within him grew brighter, fiercer, filling the clearing with a brilliant, blinding radiance. The shadows recoiled from it, twisting and writhing like 1,000 serpents retreating into the dark recesses of the world. "You're wrong," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "You don't control me anymore." The figure before him sneered, its sharp teeth flashing in the dim light. "You think you're in control? You think this light can save you? It is only a flicker in the endless night, a dying flame in the face of storm." Ethan didn't respond. He was no longer listening. Instead, he focused every last ounce of energy into the light burning inside him. He could feel the power of the altar beneath him, the pulse of the darkness that had once controlled everything, but now it was no match for the fire growing within him. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble. The stones of the altar cracked open wider, as if the very foundation of the world was being shaken. The heart beneath the altar pulsed with a deep, unsettling rhythm, its dark energy surging into the clearing like a wave of suffocating air. Ethan could feel the weight of it, the creature's presence, the figure's malevolent grin. But then, something unexpected happened. The light inside him reacted, not as a defense, but as a force that reached beyond himself. The glow intensified, crackling with energy, and the darkness retreated. The pulse of the heart beneath the altar began to slow, its beat faltering as though it were struggling against the light. The more Ethan focused on the heart, the more the light seemed to resonate with it, calling to it, weakening it. The figure before him staggered back, its eyes wide with disbelief. "Know this. This is impossible," it growled, its voice losing some of its previously confident edge. The shadows around it flickered, as if uncertain. Ethan pressed forward, his hands trembling from the sheer force of the energy coursing through him. He reached out toward the altar, his fingers brushing the cold stone, then grasped the pulsating heart with all the strength he could summon. The heart responded, shuddering in his grip. A violent burst of energy exploded outward, and for a moment, the world seemed to tear apart. The darkness around them roared. rising like a tide of hatred, but the light within Ethan pushed back harder, faster. The two forces, light and dark, collided with a deafening crack, as if the universe itself had shattered. The figure screamed, its voice distorted, torn by the raw energy surging through the air. "You cannot defeat me, mortal." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, concentrating. He wasn't just fighting the creature anymore. He was fighting himself, his own fears, his own doubt. He was willing himself to believe that the light could win, that it was enough to destroy the darkness. With one final, desperate push, Ethan forced the energy outwards. The light consumed the altar, the heart, and the figure in a blinding explosion. For a moment, the world was filled with nothing but light. Ethan's body felt weightless, floating within the brilliance, as if he were no longer tethered to the earth at all. There was no sound, no motion, only the pure, unrelenting force of light. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light flickered and vanished. The forest, once so alive with the pulsating presence of the creature, was now eerily still. The ground beneath Ethan's feet had cracked open. The altar was gone, and the heart, the source of the creature's power, was no more. The shadows had receded, leaving the forest bathed in a soft, cool light that felt like the first breath after a storm.
Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His chest burned, and his body trembled with exhaustion. The battle had taken everything from him, and yet, as he glanced around the clearing, he realized he had won. The oppressive weight of the creature's presence was gone. The darkness was no longer suffocating him. But as Ethan steadied himself and pushed himself to his feet, the whisper came again. Soft, low, and slithering like a serpent. "You think this is over?" Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He turned, but there was no figure, no creature, just the stillness of the forest. The shadows were retreating, but not all of them. Some remained, lingering in the corners of his vision. A subtle, creeping presence, like a memory he couldn't shake. No, it wasn't over. He hadn't destroyed it. The creature, its true nature, was still out there. And it would always be a part of him. But Ethan wasn't afraid anymore. He knew the truth now. He had the light, and as long as he did, the darkness could never fully consume him. It might follow him, stalk him, whisper in his ears, but Ethan was no longer just a pawn in its game. He was a warrior. And he would fight it until the end. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the silence settle over him. His chest still heaved from the exertion of the battle, but there was a sense of clarity he hadn't felt before. The shadows around him were no longer as suffocating, though they still lingered like a faint whisper on the edge of his consciousness. The forest, the world around him,
of its ominous presence. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was alone, truly alone. But the voice, that soft whisper, still gnawed at the back of his mind. "You think this is over?" The remnants of the creature's malevolent energy clung to him like a second skin. The thought that he had won, that he had defeated it, seemed laughable now. Even in this moment of victory, he knew better. The creature wasn't something that could be destroyed by light alone. It was a force, an ancient power that had existed far longer than he had. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, the stillness around him deepening. The forest was eerily quiet now, too quiet. The faint breeze that had once stirred the trees was gone, replaced by an unnatural stillness. There was something off about it, an unnatural calm. His senses tingled with the awareness that it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The shadows in the corners of his vision began to shift again, moving like they were alive, as if they were waiting. waiting for him to slip, to falter. "You cannot outrun me, Ethan," the voice whispered again, softer now, but still filled with that chilling certainty. His heart skipped a beat, but he steadied himself. This time, he refused to let fear take hold. He had come so far, had faced down the very heart of the darkness. He couldn't let it win now, not after everything. He clenched his fists, feeling the warmth of the light inside him. It was still there, pulsing faintly, ready to respond. He didn't fully understand how it worked, but he knew it was part of him now. Part of his will, part of his soul. The light wasn't just a weapon, it was the reflection of his determination, his will to survive, to fight. And this time, the creature would have to face that. He began walking through the clearing, his eyes scanning the now silent forest. Each step felt heavy, yet purposeful. Every snap of a twig beneath his feet made the silence feel more oppressive, more suffocating. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for him to make a mistake. He moved quickly, his gaze flickering between the shadows and the light, searching for any signs of movement, any hint that the creature had truly been vanquished. It hasn't gone. Not yet. The thought pierced through his mind like a sharp blade, and he pushed it away. He would not let the creature control him. Not now. He had to find the next step, the next move in this game of survival. Then, something in the distance caught his eye. A flicker. A movement. Just a flash of dark motion behind a cluster of twisted trees. His heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat. The shadows had returned, and they were no longer passive. They were moving, spreading like ink, reaching toward him. The light inside him flared. He felt it surge within him, stronger now, burning hotter with every passing second. The forest seemed to react to it, the trees shuddering as if they could feel the tension rising. The shadows hissed and writhed, twisting like serpents under his feet, but Ethan didn't stop. He could hear the creature's voice now, louder, its words warped with an unnatural cadence. "You cannot run forever. You cannot hide. I will always find you." The dark figure, the one that had once taunted him, materialized before him again, not as a shadow, but fully formed, a towering, humanoid shape, its eyes glowing with a sickly light. The grin on its face was wide and wicked, its teeth sharp as blades. "You think you're safe, but you're not." Ethan's grip tightened on the light inside him. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a war. The creature had followed him into the real world, into his mind, into his very soul. But it had underestimated one thing. Ethan was no longer the scared, vulnerable man it had first encountered. He was stronger now. His eyes narrowed, and with a roar that echoed through the forest, Ethan unleashed the full force of the light within him. It burst outward like a tidal wave, illuminating the clearing in a radiant glow, the light so intense that it seemed to sear the very air itself. The creature's grin faltered, its form flickering as if the light was pulling at it, unraveling its essence. The shadows shrieked, retreating as the light expanded, forcing the creature to recoil. "This is not over," it howled, but the voice was weaker now, less certain, as if the light was stripping it of its power. "You cannot stop what is already done. I will come for you again, Ethan. I will always find you." But Ethan didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He poured every ounce of his being into the light, focusing it, shaping it into a force powerful enough to banish the creature once and for all. The creature's form flickered again, its body trembling under the onslaught of light. Its eyes, once full of fury, now burned with a desperate, helpless rage. The darkness around it began to dissipate, unraveling like smoke in the wind. And with one final, defiant roar, the creature vanished. For a moment, all was still. The light inside Ethan began to fade, dimming to a soft glow, but the darkness that had once threatened to consume him was gone. He stood in the clearing, panting, sweat dripping down his face. His heart was pounding in his chest, but the forest around him felt empty. The oppressive presence had lifted. The shadows were no longer alive, no longer whispering to him. Ethan took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the empty landscape, half expecting the creature to return, to emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing. The forest, while twisted and scarred, seemed peaceful now. But as he turned to leave, a faint whisper brushed against his ear. "I will return." Ethan froze. The voice was distant, like an echo, but it was unmistakable. The creature was still out there, somewhere. But Ethan didn't look back. He kept walking, the light inside him still burning, though flickering weakly. He knew the fight wasn't over. Not completely. But for now, he had won. And he would keep fighting. He would never stop fighting until the creature was nothing more than a memory. A distant, fading nightmare. Ethan continued through the forest, his footsteps heavy but resolute. The air still felt thick, as if the land itself had been scarred by the battle. His senses remained alert, prickling with the knowledge that the creature was out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of hope. The light within him, though diminished, was still there. It was not gone, and for as long as it remained, he knew he could face whatever was to come. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the once terrifying shadows now silent. He had not yet reached the edge of the woods, but he was certain he was making progress. His mind was occupied with thoughts of what had just happened. The creature had not truly been destroyed. It was only temporarily pushed back, banished for a time. It was a fleeting victory, but it was victory nonetheless. And it gave him a moment to breathe, a moment to gather his strength. He didn't know what lay ahead, whether the creature would return immediately or if he would be able to rest, if only for a while. But there was one thing he knew. He couldn't keep running. Not anymore. The soft rustle of leaves behind him made him pause, his heart skipping a beat. He turned, eyes narrowing, his body tense as he searched the shadows for any signs of movement. But there was nothing. The forest was still. He exhaled slowly, trying to calm his racing heart. The creature had a way of making him feel like a hunted animal, always watching, always waiting. But it couldn't be like this forever. He wouldn't let it be. He turned back to the path ahead and pressed on, walking with purpose. There had to be a way to end this once and for all. He needed answers. The forest may have quieted for now, but there were pieces of the puzzle still missing. The altar, the ancient heart, the shadows, it was all connected, but how? Ethan didn't know the answers yet, but he had learned enough to understand that the creature's power was tied to something much older, much deeper than he had first realized. It wasn't just some ancient evil haunting the forest. It was a primal force, one that had woven itself into the very fabric of the world. And to defeat it, he would have to learn how to unravel it completely. But how? The thought lingered in his mind like a shadow, gnawing at him. He had touched the source of the creature's power, the dark heart that pulsed beneath the altar, but he had no idea how to destroy it, how to sever its hold over the world. He didn't even know where to begin. His eyes scanned the trees around him, his mind lost in thought. That's when he saw it. A glimmer of light, faint but undeniable, flickering through the underbrush. It wasn't like the warm, comforting light that had once burned inside him. It was colder, sharper, almost unnatural. Curiosity stirred in his chest, but he was cautious. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of the blade at his side, his senses on high alert. He approached the light slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, he realized it wasn't light at all. It was an object, a small, smooth stone, glowing faintly in the twilight of the forest. He knelt beside it, studying the markings on its surface, symbols similar to the ones he had seen etched into the altar. But these were different. They were more intricate, more delicate, like they were made for someone with a deep understanding of the old magic. Without thinking, Ethan reached out and picked up the stone. As soon as his fingers brushed its surface, a jolt of energy shot through him, electrifying his body. He gasped, his vision blurring for a split second as the energy coursed through him. The stone was ancient, pulsing with a strange, foreign power. But it wasn't just the stone itself, it was what the stone represented. Ethan's mind raced. This was a key, a part of something larger. He could feel it deep inside him. The creature wasn't the only player in this twisted game. There were forces at work here, ancient forces that went beyond what he had understood. And this stone, this was a piece of it. He stood, his grip tight on the stone. The glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, as though it were attuned to him. Take it. The voice was faint, like a whisper on the wind. But Ethan's blood ran cold when he recognized it. The figure, the voice he had heard before, the same voice that had taunted him, that had warned him of an inevitable return. Take it, Ethan. Take the key and unlock what you don't understand. The shadows in the forest shifted, creeping at the edges of his vision once again. He could feel the presence of the creature, distant but still there. It was watching, waiting. But the voice wasn't the creature. This was something else. Ethan clenched the stone tighter, pushing the cold chill that ran through his veins to the back of his mind. He wasn't sure what this meant, but he knew it was a turning point. He had to follow the thread, unravel the mystery. Whatever this stone was, whatever it unlocked, was key to stopping the creature for good. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. He knew the creature would not let him walk away from this, not without a fight. And yet, Ethan felt a strange resolve settle over him. The darkness still loomed, but he could feel the light in his chest, flickering but steady. It was a part of him, and as long as it remained, he would not surrender. The stone pulsed again in his palm. It was almost as though it was guiding him, pulling him forward. Without another glance back, Ethan set his gaze ahead. It was time to uncover the truth. Time to stop the creature and whatever forces were behind it. Time to finish what he had started. And he would fight whatever it took until the end. Ethan moved through the forest with a new sense of purpose. The stone still glowing faintly in his hand. The path ahead felt clearer now, though uncertainty clung to him like the shadows at his back. He could feel the creature's presence, lingering in the dark corners of his mind, always watching, always waiting. But now there's something else: the stone, the symbols, the whispers in his ear. They were guiding him, urging him forward. The forest had changed. The trees, once menacing and distorted, seemed to lean in closer now, their branches twisting as though trying to listen to the secrets the stone held. The air was thick with the weight of old magic, and as he walked, the faint hum of the stone resonated with the energy that surrounded him. It was as if the very ground beneath his feet was alive, shifting, breathing with the pulse of the ancient forces that had woven themselves into the world. As he pressed deeper into the woods, the light from the stone grew stronger, its glow illuminating the path ahead. The shadows that had once seemed to surround him like a suffocating cloak now retreated, pulling away in the face of the stone's power. Ethan felt the weight of the darkness recede, but he knew it was still there, just out of sight, lurking in the forgotten corners of the world. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost like a lullaby in the breeze. You're getting closer. The voice was neither familiar nor alien. It was a strange combination of both, calm yet filled with an undeniable urgency. It wasn't the creature's voice, but it was something equally ancient, equally profound. The more Ethan walked, the more the feeling of being watched intensified, the very trees seeming to hold their breath. And then, just ahead, the trees parted. Before him stood a large, weathered stone structure, overgrown with vines and moss. It was a temple, or perhaps an altar, ancient and forgotten. The stone walls were etched with the same intricate symbols that adorned the glowing stone in his hand. The ground was cracked, uneven, but there was an undeniable sense of power emanating from it, something old and deeply embedded in the earth. This was it. This was where everything had led him. The heart, the altar, the creature, it all connected here to this place. The creature's power hadn't been rooted in the forest itself. It had been connected to this ancient temple, this forgotten source of magic. And somehow, this stone he held was tied to it. Ethan stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The light from the stone pulsed brighter as he approached the entrance. He had no idea what to expect, no understanding of what he was about to uncover. But he knew he had to go inside. He could feel the weight of the creature's presence pulling him toward it, an inescapable draw. The creature knew he was here, and it would not let him enter without a fight. He reached the entrance and hesitated, the stone still glowing in his hand, its warmth almost comforting now. As he stepped through the threshold, the air grew colder. The temple's interior was dark, the air thick with dust and age. A low hum vibrated through the walls, a strange resonance that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. He moved forward, every step echoing in the silence. The walls were adorned with more symbols, and at the far end of the temple stood a massive stone structure, a pulpit, perhaps, or another altar. It was raised above the floor, and upon it rested something that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. A dark crystal. The crystal was enormous, its edges sharp and jagged, glowing with a sinister energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It pulsed with a rhythm that mirrored his own heartbeat, dark veins of energy spreading through the stone like cracks in a shattered mirror. Ethan could feel the creature's power radiating from it, as if it were the source, the anchor to everything that had plagued him. He felt the stone in his hand react to the presence of the dark crystal. The pulsing glow from the stone he held grew brighter, hotter, as though they were in conflict, battling for dominance. The voice came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have come." The words were dripping with malice, cold as ice, and they echoed throughout the temple. Ethan's grip on the stone tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had come too far to turn back now. This was the source of the creature's power. It had to be destroyed, or the darkness would continue to spread. He stepped closer to the altar, his mind racing. How could he destroy something this powerful? Something this old? The stone in his hand pulsed again, and for a moment, Ethan had a vision. A brief, fleeting image, an image of the crystal shattering, a blinding light engulfing the temple, the creature screaming as it was torn apart. It was a vision of victory, but the cost was unknown. He felt a sudden pull in his chest, as if the stone and the crystal were calling to each other, drawing him closer. His mind screamed at him to hesitate, to be cautious. But the weight of the vision, of the potential power that lay before him, was too great to ignore. Ethan raised the stone high, holding it over his head. The dark crystal responded, its pulse quickening, as if it were preparing for a battle, as if it knew what was coming. The ground trembled beneath his feet. The shadows in the room thickened, coiling around him like a living entity, but Ethan didn't move. His eyes were locked on the crystal, his pulse quickening, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, with a final, desperate cry, the voice, the creature's voice, rang through the temple, as if it were ripping through his very mind. "No, you cannot take this from me. You will never stop me." Ethan didn't flinch. With every ounce of strength, he slammed the stone into the dark crystal. The impact sent a shock wave through the temple, the light from the stone flaring to blinding intensity. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then the explosion came. The entire temple shook violently as the crystal shattered, sending shards of dark energy flying in every direction. Ethan was thrown backward, crashing against the stone wall. His vision blurred, the world spinning around him. The creature's scream echoed in the air, loud and terrifying, as if it were being torn apart. The dark energy flooded the room, but it was weaker now, fading, unraveling. The temple began to crumble, the walls cracking, the floor shattering, as if the very foundation of the world was breaking apart. Ethan struggled to his feet, his head spinning, but he knew he had done it. The creature's power was gone. The crystal, its anchor, was destroyed. The source of the darkness was no more. But as the temple collapsed around him, Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't over. Not completely. He could still feel the creature's presence, its essence, its will lingering in the air, like a shadow that refused to be fully banished. Ethan didn't stop. He ran, the walls of the crumbling temple collapsing around him. But he pushed forward, desperate to escape, knowing that the creature would never fully fade. Not yet, but for the first time, he felt something he hadn't before. Hope. The battle wasn't over, but he had won the first fight, and he would keep fighting no matter what. The temple was collapsing in on itself, the ground beneath Ethan's feet shaking violently as the walls cracked and crumbled. Dust and debris filled the air, and the air itself seemed to burn with the remnants of the shattered crystal. The creature's screams echoed through the collapsing stone, as if its very essence was being torn apart. The dark energy that had once thrived within the temple now swirled, fading, unraveling, and Ethan could feel it. He didn't have much time. The temple was disintegrating, but something told him that even as the foundation crumbled, the creature's influence remained. It was still out there, lingering in the shadows, waiting for a chance to resurface. The destruction of the crystal had fractured the creature's power, but it had not been fully destroyed. No, Ethan knew that for certain now, whatever this thing was, it was too ancient, too deeply ingrained in the fabric of the world to be wiped away in a single strike. But still, he had done something. The stone had worked, the crystal had shattered, and the energy had been broken. The creature's hold on the world had weakened. That much was undeniable. Ethan ran, his boots pounding against the cracked floor, the ceiling above him groaning in protest as chunks of stone fell. He didn't look back, even though the fear in his chest told him that something was still pursuing him, still reaching for him. The echoes of the creature's rage rang in his ears, and he could feel its malicious presence, like a cold wind at the back of his neck, following him, always following him. He burst through the entrance of the temple, into the open air, and the outside world greeted him with an almost surreal calm. The forest, which had been so alive with danger, now seemed still. The trees that had once whispered and writhed in darkness stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The stifling energy had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. But the silence wasn't comforting. Ethan dropped to his knees, breathing heavily, his body aching from the battle, from the exertion. The stone he held was still glowing, though its light had dimmed to a faint pulse. His chest heaved with each breath, but he knew he couldn't rest. Not yet. Not while the creature's essence still lingered. The ground trembled again, and for a moment, Ethan thought the temple was going to collapse entirely, burying him in its ruin. But it wasn't the temple, it was the land itself, shifting as if something was moving beneath the earth. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the forest. The sound was not one made by any animal. It was the creature, the one he had thought was defeated, but it wasn't. It was still there, somewhere. It hadn't left. It was too powerful, too deeply entrenched in this place. Ethan stood up slowly, his legs shaky, his mind reeling. He looked toward the horizon. There, just beyond the trees, something stirred in the distance, something dark, something moving unnaturally. The creature was regathering itself, trying to rebuild its power. He could feel it. The very air seemed charged with its energy, as if the land was breathing in the darkness. But it wasn't just the creature. The stone in his hand pulsed again, stronger this time. The energy was responding, the power of the crystal now gone, leaving the stone as the only remaining conduit to the energy. Ethan had no idea how or why, but he could feel the connection between the two, the creature, the stone, the land, and he knew what he had to do. He couldn't just destroy the creature. He had to sever the connection between it and the earth itself. This wasn't just about killing the creature, it was about ending the cycle. It had been there for millennia, lurking beneath the surface, feeding on the darkness that had seeped into the world. It had become part of the land, part of the soil, part of the roots of the trees. Ethan tightened his grip on the stone. There was no time to waste. He turned toward the source of the growl, toward the shifting darkness, and he began to walk. His pace was slow at first, cautious, but with each step, the stone in his hand grew warmer, brighter. The ground beneath him trembled again, and the air grew thick with the heavy presence of the creature. But Ethan didn't hesitate. The whispers came again, louder now, filling his mind with words that made his skin crawl. "You cannot escape me, Ethan. You cannot stop me. I am the darkness. I am the land. I am everything." The voice was everywhere. It was in his thoughts, in his bones, in the very air he breathed. He could feel the creature's influence invading his mind, pulling at his thoughts, trying to drown him in despair. But he fought back. He focused on the light inside him, the warmth of the stone, the flicker of hope that had been reignited in his chest. He had felt the power of the creature before. He knew what it could do. But now, for the first time, he understood something more, something deeper. The creature was not just a monster to be slain. It was an ancient force, a primal force of nature, tied to the earth itself. To truly defeat it, he had to understand it. He had to sever its connection to the land, to the world it had fed off for so long. And that was the key. The stone. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a tool. A key to unlocking the truth, to severing the bond between the creature and the land. He could feel the stone's power coursing through him now, stronger than ever before. It was a link to something older than the creature itself, a power that had been lost to time, but was now awakening. Ethan's steps quickened. The darkness ahead was growing, a swirling mass of shadows that seemed to distort reality itself. He had no idea what he was about to face, but he knew it would be the final confrontation. It had to be. The creature's growl grew louder, closer. Ethan could feel its presence pressing against him, suffocating him, as though it were trying to crush him with sheer will. He held the stone higher, focusing all of his energy into it, allowing its light to shine through the darkness. "You cannot defeat me," the creature roared. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he focused, letting the stone pulse in his hand, the energy within him swelling. He could feel the energy building, growing stronger with each passing second. He wasn't just fighting the creature. He was fighting the very darkness that had infected the land, the source of its power. And with a final, deafening cry, he unleashed the full force of the light within the stone. The world around him exploded in light. The creature's scream was torn from its throat, but it was drowned out by the blinding surge of energy that flooded the forest. The shadows evaporated, the darkness ripping apart as the light consumed it. Ethan stood firm, his heart racing, but his resolve unyielding. The ground beneath him cracked, the earth itself shuddering as if it were being torn apart. The stone in his hand flared brightly, its pulse synchronized with the surge of energy. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The air was still. The ground was silent. The creature was gone. For a moment, Ethan could do nothing but stand there, panting, the stone still glowing faintly in his hand. The darkness had retreated, and the forest had returned to its natural state. The oppressive weight that had lingered for so long had lifted. But as he looked around, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. The creature had been defeated, but the forces it had awakened were still out there. There would be more to face, more battles to fight. But for now, the world was safe. For now, the darkness had been banished. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had won. Ethan stood in the quiet aftermath, the glowing stone still pulsating faintly in his hand. The air felt thick with the remnants of the battle, and the forest around him, once alive with unnatural movement, was now eerily still. The oppressive presence that had clouded the trees, the land, the very earth itself was gone. The creature's voice had been silenced, its growls fading into nothingness. But something lingered in the back of Ethan's mind. A question, a warning, a thought he couldn't fully grasp. The battle had been won, but was it truly over? The stone in his hand pulsed again, as if trying to answer the question that hung heavy in the air. He studied it closely, now realizing that it was not just a key or a weapon, but something more, something that had tapped into a power far older than anything he had ever encountered. It was as if the stone itself held a part of the world's ancient history, a force beyond comprehension. And even though the creature had been driven back, there was still so much about the stone that he didn't understand. A faint breeze swept through the trees, the rustling of the leaves the only sound in the air. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a distant rumbling, a low growl, like an echo of the creature's rage, but this time it felt different. This was no longer the monster's scream, but something far more unsettling. The earth itself seemed to groan as if the battle had left cracks deep within the fabric of the land. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he turned his gaze toward the horizon. There, just beyond the trees, something shifted. A figure appeared, barely visible in the dim light, moving with unnatural grace, its form indistinct against the shadows. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the creature. It couldn't be. The figure stepped forward into the clearing, and Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized what it was, a person, but not like any person he had ever seen. Their skin was pale, almost ethereal, and their eyes glowed faintly with the same eerie light that now radiated from the stone. They were tall, their movements smooth and fluid, but there was something about them that was both otherworldly and unervingly familiar. The figure spoke, their voice soft but carrying an undeniable authority. "You have broken the chain, Ethan." Ethan tensed, the stone still clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't know who or what this was, but he knew one thing for sure: they weren't ordinary. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline that made his hand shake. The figure's lips curled into a subtle smile. "I am the one who has watched over the earth for as long as it has existed. I am the keeper of the balance between light and dark, between the seen and the unseen." Ethan felt his stomach drop. The balance. He glanced down at the stone, which seemed to pulse stronger now, resonating with something deeper within him. "You mean the stone? It's part of some greater force, something more than just the creature." The figure nodded. Yes, the creature was but a symptom, a manifestation of an ancient evil that sought to corrupt the very heart of the world. It was a parasite, feeding off the balance between worlds. The stone you carry. It is the last fragment of a force that existed long before the creatures of this world. A force that was meant to protect, but which was buried and forgotten over time. Ethan's head spun. So this stone, it wasn't just a weapon against the creature. The figure's gaze softened slightly, but their expression was still distant, their tone grave. No, it is far more than that. It is the last tether that binds the forces of this world to the ancient order. And now, that tether has been broken. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a sense of unease growing within him. "What do you mean, broken?" The figure stepped closer, the air around them crackling with an energy he couldn't quite place. The creature was one of the last of its kind, a guardian of the dark forces that have sought to disrupt the balance. With its defeat, the forces it once held at bay are free once more. The world is now vulnerable, Ethan. The stone was meant to be a part of the cycle, a safeguard against the darkness. But now, Ethan's thoughts whirled. Now what? His voice was a strained whisper. Now the world is teetering on the edge. The darkness is not gone. It's merely been released, scattered, like a seed waiting to grow again. And the stone, though powerful, is no longer bound to its intended purpose. It needs to be restored, refortified, or else. The figure's voice trailed off, and Ethan saw something in their eyes, something dark and ancient that made his blood run cold. Or else what? Ethan asked, a knot forming in his stomach. The figure's gaze grew distant, and they didn't immediately answer. Instead, They glanced toward the horizon, where the darkness still seemed to stir, as though drawn to some unseen force. Or else the world will crumble. The forces of darkness, once buried, will grow once more. The creature was only a fragment, but it will not be the last. Others will rise, more powerful, more dangerous. The land will fall into chaos unless the stone is reforged, unless the balance is restored. Ethan's mind reeled as he tried to grasp the magnitude of the situation. He had thought he had destroyed the creature, that he had ended the threat once and for all. But now it seemed as though that was only the beginning. The creature was a symptom, and whatever it had represented was far more insidious than he had realized. The figure's eyes locked onto Ethan's, and their voice softened, almost regretful. The stone you hold was never meant to be wielded by one person. It is part of an ancient bond, an eternal cycle. Without it, the world will fall back into the same chaos it once knew. And you, the figure paused, seeming to consider their next words carefully. You may be the only one who can restore it. The stone is tied to you now, as much as you're tied to it. But you must choose, Ethan. Will you carry its burden? Will you face the darkness once again? Ethan's mind raced. The weight of the decision before him felt unbearable, like the very air around him had thickened, pressing in on him from all sides. But there was no time to waste. The choice had already been made the moment he had picked up the stone. He looked down at the glowing stone, its light pulsing with an energy that felt like a heartbeat, like it was alive within him. He could feel its power, the immense weight of it, and yet he also felt a sense of connection. The figure was right. The stone was bound to him now. There was no turning back. What I need to do? Ethan asked, his voice quiet but resolute. The figure's eyes held a glimmer of something ancient and wise, and they spoke one final time. You must journey to the heart of the world, to the place where the first balance was created. There, you will restore the stone, and with it, restore the world. But beware, Ethan. The darkness will follow. It always does. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the task ahead of him. He didn't know how or where this journey would lead, but one thing was certain. His fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself against the overwhelming weight of the task ahead. The figure's words lingered in his mind like a shadow, casting doubt and fear in equal measure. But there was no other choice. The darkness had already shown its face once, and it would not stop until it consumed everything. He had felt its power, its hunger, and now it was clear. The balance could not be left in pieces. The stone pulsed again in his hand, a reminder of what he was carrying, of the immense responsibility that had been thrust upon him. But as he glanced back at the figure, he saw a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, something that made his resolve harden even further. This wasn't just about defeating some monstrous creature. It was about saving the entire world from an ancient, insidious force. Where do I find this place? Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at his insides. The figures stepped closer, their presence almost ethereal, as if they were part of the very air itself. They extended a long, slender arm, pointing toward the farthest horizon, where the sun had dipped below the trees, casting the land in a twilight hue. The direction seemed to lead into a dense, mist-covered expanse, a place Ethan had never ventured into before. The heart of the world lies beyond the place you know. It is hidden from the eyes of mortals, but those who seek it with purpose will find their way. Follow the path of the forgotten ones, and the stone will guide you, the figure said cryptically. Ethan's stomach tightened. The forgotten ones? The figure's lips curled into a faint, wistful smile. The ones who came before, the first guardians. They too carried the stone in another age long lost. You will find their remains, their markings, in a land where time has forgotten them. And there, you will find what you seek. But beware, the path is treacherous. Many have tried, and none have returned. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The figure's words were both a warning and a prophecy, but there was no turning back now. I'll find it, Ethan said, more to reassure himself than anything else. The figure nodded slowly. You are not alone in this, Ethan. The stone's power is tied to you, but you are bound to it as well. It will lead you when the time is right. Trust in it. But remember, the darkness is never far behind. It will try to twist your path, make you question your purpose. Stay true to what you must do. Ethan glanced down at the stone again, its warm light filling his palm like a heartbeat. He nodded. I understand. The figure didn't respond immediately, but their gaze held something unspoken, something like sorrow. And then, without another word, they turned and began to walk away, vanishing into the shadows of the trees as if they had never been there at all. Ethan stood alone in the clearing, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that he was about to embark on a journey far darker and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. But he had no choice. The world was teetering on the edge, and it was up to him to restore the balance. With a final, determined look at the forest before him, he set off in the direction the figure had pointed, toward the mist-covered horizon. The journey felt endless, the path winding through dense forests, over craggy hills, and across rivers that twisted and writhed beneath the weight of the earth. The stone pulsed in his hand, each beat of its light like a whisper in his ear, guiding him, urging him onward. The further he ventured into the unknown, the more the land seemed to change. The air grew thick and heavy. The trees grew twisted and gnarled, their roots reaching out like skeletal hands. The grass was endless. The world seemed to close in on him, its dark presence pressing against him with every step. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The shadows seemed deeper here, stretching unnaturally long, even in the faint light of dusk. There was a constant hum in the air, a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was as if the land was alive, aware of him, of his presence, and it didn't welcome him. After what felt like days of walking, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of a vast, desolate valley. The ground here was cracked and barren, the remnants of a long-forgotten battle etched into the landscape. A cold wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far older, something unnatural. The stone in his hand pulsed more rapidly now, as if it recognized this place for what it was. This was it, the heart of the world. He could feel the weight of the land pressing against him, the silence deafening as he took a hesitant step forward. As he moved further into the valley, the stone grew hotter in his hand, the light flickering wildly, guiding him towards something buried beneath the earth. The ground cracked open, and beneath it, an ancient structure began to emerge. Massive stone columns, worn down by time, rose from the ground like forgotten titans. The air grew colder still, and a deep, rumbling sound reverberated through the earth. Ethan swallowed hard, the stone's glow now a steady, pulsating rhythm. He was here. This was the place where the guardians of old had once stood, where the balance had been created. But what had happened to it? Why had it been forgotten? He stepped closer to the ruins, each movement slow and deliberate, as if the ground itself might swallow him whole. And then, just as he reached the heart of the structure, the earth beneath him trembled. A crack appeared in the stone, and a voice, deep, echoing, rose from the depths. You have come. Too late. The words were not spoken by a person, but by the land itself, a voice older than time. The darkness was here. It had followed him. And now, the real battle was about to begin. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as the earth beneath him trembled again. The stone in his hand grew unbearably hot, its pulse now a frantic, rhythmic thrum that seemed to match the pounding of his own heart. The voice, echoing, deep, and ancient, came from all directions, as if the land itself had come alive, surrounding him in a suffocating grip. You should not have come. The words reverberated through the very air, like a sinister whisper carried on the wind. Ethan's eyes darted around the ruins, his senses on high alert, but there was nothing to see. The valley was still, its barren landscape stretching endlessly in all directions, save for the stone pillars that seemed to groan under the weight of centuries. But then, something began to stir in the depths of the earth. The ground split open wider, revealing dark, shifting tendrils of shadow creeping up from beneath. These shadows weren't like the ones in the forest, cold and distant. They were alive, twisting, reaching for him with a hunger that made his skin crawl. His breath quickened as he stepped back, but the stone in his hand seemed to pull him forward, urging him closer to the heart of the ancient ruins. Suddenly, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall and shrouded in a cloak of inky shadows, its face hidden in the folds of the fabric. The figure was like a silhouette against the swirling darkness, and as it moved, the very ground seemed to warp and writhe beneath its feet. The air grew thick with malice, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Ethan could see his breath misting in the air. The voice that spoke next was not the land's, but the figure's, its tone dripping with an unsettling calm. "You think you can restore the balance, mortal?" Ethan's stomach tightened. His instincts screamed at him to turn and run, to escape the suffocating grip of the darkness. But he couldn't move. The stone pulsed again, stronger now, almost violently, as if it were warning him, or perhaps preparing him for what was to come. "You are but a pawn in a game you do not understand." The figure continued, its voice growing colder, its presence oppressive. "The stone you carry is not what you think it is. It is a tether, yes, but not to the light. It binds you to the darkness as much as it binds you to the light. You will never escape it." Ethan's grip on the stone tightened. "I'm not here to bargain with you," he spat, his voice trembling but defiant. "I'm here to restore what you've destroyed." The figure laughed, a sound that echoed across the valley like the cry of some ancient beast. "Restore? There's no restoring what was broken long before you came. The balance has already shifted, Ethan. The darkness is not something that can be contained. It will consume this world, just as it consumed the one before it." Ethan's mind raced, the weight of the figure's words sinking in like a poison. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question, and then finally stepped forward, the shadows around it parting like a veil. As it approached, the ground beneath it cracked and splintered, and Ethan could see that its body, if it could be called that, was made of shifting, dark energy, not flesh. It was as though the very darkness had taken form, woven together by some malevolent will. "I am the one who was forgotten, the one who remains when all others are consumed," the figure said, its voice a hiss now, the words carrying an otherworldly weight. "I'm the one who set the darkness free long ago. You are nothing but a fleeting shadow, a speck of light in a dying world. And now that the stone has been broken, you will see what happens when the balance is torn apart." Ethan's pulse raced. The figure's words were like a sickness, trying to sink into his mind, try to make him doubt everything he had believed. But he couldn't allow himself to fall into that trap. He had come this far for a reason. The world was counting on him. The stone. It isn't just a weapon, is it? Ethan asked, trying to piece together the puzzle. The figure smiled, a twisted, hollow expression. "No, it is not a weapon, nor is it a savior. It is a piece of the cycle, a part of the eternal struggle. It binds the worlds together, keeping them in balance. But you, Ethan, have undone that bond. The stone's power has shifted, and with it, so has the world." The figure's hand, long and skeletal, reached out, and Ethan could feel the darkness swirling around him, pressing in. His mind flashed to the forest, to the creature he had fought, to the warning the figure had given him before. The darkness will follow. And now it was here. It was closing in. "The stone is no longer your ally," the figure continued. "It is your burden, and it will drag you down into the abyss." Ethan's thoughts spun in a dizzying whirl. Was it true? Had he unwittingly brought about the very destruction he sought to prevent? He had always known that the balance between light and dark was fragile, but he never imagined that it could be so easily broken. The stone had seemed like his answer, the key to stopping the creature and saving the world. But now, it seemed like the very source of the chaos. He glanced down at it. The stone had gone cold in his hand, its light dimming to a faint glow, as though it, too, was struggling against the weight of the forces at play. The figure seemed to sense his uncertainty and took a step closer, its presence suffocating. You see it now, don't you? The truth. You have no control over what you carry. You are as much a prisoner of the stone as it is of you. Ethan gritted his teeth, trying to steady himself, to hold on to the one truth that had driven him here. He couldn't let the darkness win. He couldn't let everything he had fought for be in vain. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the valley. The stone in his hand flared with light, brighter than it ever had before. It pulsed, stronger, hotter, as though it were responding to the figure's presence. The figure flinched back, a brief flicker of fear crossing its shadowed face. No, this isn't how it was supposed to happen. The stone surged again, and Ethan's body felt electrified with energy. He could feel the power coursing through him, not just from the stone, but from something deeper, something connected to the very heart of the world. The darkness recoiled, as if it recognized that the stone was not just a tool to be used, but a force of nature, something older and more dangerous than anything it had encountered before. Ethan lifted his hand, and the stone glowed so brightly now that the darkness around him began to dissipate, the shadows retreating like smoke in the wind. "This ends now," he whispered. The figure snarled, a hiss of frustration and rage tearing from its lips as the shadows around it began to fade, unable to withstand the stone's light. But before it could retaliate, the stone pulsed one final time, and in that moment, the land trembled violently, as if the earth itself was resetting. And then, the darkness was gone. The valley was silent once more. The shadows had vanished. The air was still, as if holding its breath, and the ground beneath Ethan's feet had stopped trembling. He was alone, but the stone in his hand was no longer pulsing. It was cold, silent. The battle was over. For now, Ethan took a deep, steadying breath, his heart still racing, but the weight in his chest had lessened. The darkness had been pushed back for now, but as he looked toward the horizon, he knew this was only the beginning. The balance had been restored, but the fight was far from over. The stone had not broken the cycle. It had merely delayed it, and the darkness. It was always waiting. Ethan stood in the heart of the valley, the remnants of the darkness still hanging in the air like a bad memory, faint but unmistakable. The stone had gone cold in his hand, the light from it now a faint, flickering pulse, like the last heartbeat of a dying star. His mind buzzed with the events that had just unfolded, the battle, the figure, the overwhelming weight of the realization that he had only delayed the inevitable. The valley around him was eerily silent now. No wind stirred the twisted trees. No birds called out from the distant heights. It felt like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or perhaps, waiting for him to leave. But Ethan knew he couldn't leave just yet. The darkness hadn't been vanquished. It had only been repelled, driven back into the depths for the moment. He could feel it lingering, just out of reach, like a predator watching from the shadows. And the stone, it felt like it was warning him. The pulse of its glow, though faint, seemed to call to him, beckoning him towards something deeper within the ruins. Taking one final, reluctant glance around the silent valley, Ethan began to move forward, his boots crunching over the cracked earth. The stone was still in his hand, cool now, but its weight heavier than ever. It was as though it had absorbed all the darkness that had been released, and now was silently waiting for its next command. He didn't know where the ruins were leading him. He only knew he had to keep going. The stone might have temporarily sealed the wound in the world, but the wound wasn't gone. It was merely hidden. And the figure had been right about one thing. Ethan was a pawn in this grand game, but there was still a chance to play his part and change the course of the inevitable. The ruins around him grew more expansive as he ventured deeper, their jagged stone pillars rising from the earth like the remains of some ancient civilization long forgotten. The markings on the stones grew more intricate, more bizarre, almost as if they were alive, etched with symbols that Ethan couldn't decipher. He could feel them pulling at him, urging him to understand. Then, in the distance, something caught his eye. There, at the far end of the ruins, a massive stone door stood half buried in the earth. Its surface was covered in carvings, some faded with time, others still sharp and clear. The door seemed to pulse with a strange energy, not like the stone in his hand, but something ancient, something far older. A new wave of unease washed over him, his pulse quickening as he approached the door. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold stone. As his touch met the surface, the air around him seemed to hum, vibrating with a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The stone in his hand pulsed once, twice, and then a light began to form in the crevices of the door, illuminating the ancient markings. The carvings shifted as if alive, moving and rearranging into something new. The door groaned, its massive stone panels beginning to move, slowly, like the opening of some ancient crypt. Dust and debris fell away as the door parted, revealing a dark passageway beyond. The scent of old earth, damp stone, and decay hit him like a wave. Ethan hesitated, his hand instinctively tightening around the stone. It pulsed again, as though encouraging him to enter, to face whatever lay beyond. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew there was no turning back now. The darkness was still out there, waiting. The answers, the truth, whatever had been hidden here for so long, was buried deep within. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped through the door, his footfalls echoing in the silence. The passageway was narrow, and the air grew colder the further he walked. The stone walls pressed in on him, their surfaces smooth and unyielding, the ancient symbols on them now glowing faintly, reacting to his presence, as though they recognized the stone he carried. He followed the winding path, each step growing heavier, as if the weight of the place was bearing down on him. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows becoming thicker, darker, until he could barely make out the path ahead. The light from the stone was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Suddenly, the path opened up into a vast chamber. The ceiling was lost in the shadows above, and the floor stretched out into a massive pit that seemed to swallow the light from the stone. But it was what lay at the center of the chamber that caught Ethan's attention, a large pedestal raised on a stone platform. Atop it, resting in a bed of shadows, was another stone. This one was different. Its surface was smooth, black as midnight, with veins of dark red running through it like blood coursing beneath its skin. It radiated an unsettling energy, pulsing with the same rhythm as the stone in his hand, but much stronger, much more malevolent. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the source. The stone in his hand pulsed violently, as though reacting to the presence of its twin. His grip tightened around it instinctively, as though the stone was urging him to take it, to place it alongside the one on the pedestal. But something deep inside him, some primal instinct, warned him not to. The pull of the stones together was undeniable, but he felt a growing dread, as if the two stones were meant to work in harmony, but at a terrible cost. "Don't do it." The voice came out of nowhere, so sudden that it froze Ethan in his tracks. He spun around, searching the chamber, but saw nothing. "You don't understand. Not yet." The voice was older than time, deep and resonant. Ethan felt it not just in his ears, but in his bones. It was the voice of the land itself, or was something much older, something that had watched over this place for centuries. "That stone is the heart of the darkness you fought. It is the source of the power you fear. You cannot undo what has already been done." Ethan took a step back, the stone in his hand pulsing erratically as if it were trying to warn him. "What are you?" he whispered into the vast, empty space. "I'm the keeper of the balance," the voice responded, its tone almost sorrowful. "And you, Ethan, are its last hope. But you must choose, take the stone and destroy it, or let the cycle repeat itself once more." The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a crushing wave. The stone pulsed once again, urging him forward. His heart pounded in his chest. The world, the balance, depended on what he chose next. With a steadying breath, Ethan took a step toward the pedestal. As Ethan approached the pedestal, the stone in his hand began to tremble, its pulse quickening, almost as though it was alive, sensing the presence of its counterpart. The chamber was thick with tension, the silence heavy, broken only by the soft echo of his footsteps against the cold stone floor. The dark stone atop the pedestal seemed to draw him in, its deep, dark veins pulsating in time with his heartbeat. His fingers ached with the need to reach out and touch it, to bring both stones together, to feel the culmination of everything that had brought him here. The pull was irresistible, like a magnetic force that demanded to be answered. But deep inside, the voice, the one that had spoken from the shadows, lingered in his mind, its warning echoing in the hollow of his thoughts. Destroy it, or let the cycle repeat. Ethan halted a few paces away from the pedestal. The stone in his hand flared bright, its light pushing back the darkness, but only for a moment. It flickered and then dimmed again, as if it too was unsure of what to do. He could feel the weight of its power, the sense that whatever decision he made now would alter the course of everything. The chamber was growing colder. The shadows, once retreating, began to creep back and around him, as if the very stone itself were alive, pulling the darkness from the depths. Ethan's breath grew visible in the chill. The light from a stone in his hand pulsed weakly, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. He had come so far. So many had died. His mind flashed to the face of the creature, the terror that had gripped his village, the friends he'd lost. The weight of that responsibility crushed him. Could he really be the one to end it? To stop the darkness from consuming everything? The stone in his hand seemed to burn hotter, as though it was pleading with him. "I've come to fix this," Ethan whispered aloud, as much to himself as to the unknown force that spoke to him. And then, without thinking, his hand reached out. The moment his fingers brushed against the dark stone on the pedestal, everything around him exploded into light. The stones, both of them, surged with power, bright, blinding, intense. The pulse from both stones collided, sending a shock wave through the chamber that rattled the walls and cracked the floor beneath him. The light was overwhelming, but there was something else too. A sensation like the entire world was holding its breath. And no, the voice from the darkness shouted, the fury in its tone more real than any force Ethan had felt before. Ethan's grip tightened around the stones, as if he could somehow control the force raging between them. The two stones seemed to call to each other, like opposites being drawn together, one dark, one light. He couldn't explain it, but the energy felt familiar, as if it were a part of him. Something deep inside him stirred, a connection that he couldn't break, no matter how hard he tried. But the power surged again, and he felt himself being pulled into it. "You fool," the voice bellowed, now a mere whisper in his mind, its power crackling in the air. "You do not understand. The stones are not a cure. They're the cause. The darkness will never be defeated until the stone is destroyed. But you've chosen to bind them together, haven't you?" The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The stone was not just a tool. It wasn't simply a key to stopping the darkness. It was a part of the very cycle that had plagued the world for centuries. As the stone's power reached its peak, a deep, resounding crack echoed through the chamber. Ethan gasped, the room shaking violently. The ground beneath him split, and jagged stone shot up from the earth, forming new, twisted shapes. The light from the stones began to flicker in wild bursts, the darkness fighting against it, as if an unseen battle were being fought right under the surface of the world. The energy coming from the stones surged once more, and suddenly, the entire chamber seemed to pulse with one singular, earth-shattering tremor. Then silence. Ethan was thrown back, landing hard against the stone floor. The light and darkness both faded, leaving the chamber in an almost unnatural stillness. His body ached, his head spun, and he could barely move as he lay there on the ground, staring up at the darkened ceiling. And that's when he saw it. In the center of the chamber, where the pedestal had once stood, was a blackened stone, cracked and shattered in half. The other stone, the one he had carried, lay beside it, the light completely extinguished. They were no longer pulsing, no longer connected, but they were no longer a thread, either. The silence stretched on, oppressive, as though the entire world was waiting for him to rise. To make sense of what had just happened, Ethan struggled to his feet, his limbs heavy and uncoordinated, but his mind was clear. The stones, both of them, were broken, their power shattered. And in that instant, Ethan realized what the voice had meant. Destroying them, breaking their bond, had ended the cycle of darkness. For now, it was over, but it had come at a terrible price. The air around him was still, but there was something deeply wrong in the stillness. The stone's destruction had brought about an unnatural calm, but this calm didn't feel like peace. It felt like the world had been frozen in place, like a moment that had been suspended in time, waiting for something else to happen. His gaze fell to the shattered remains of the two stones, scattered before him like forgotten relics. The cracks in the earth beneath him seemed to pulse in the aftermath of the stone's destruction, as though the land itself had been wounded. The figure's warning echoed in his mind. You've broken the cycle. But at what cost? Ethan's stomach twisted. He hadn't destroyed the darkness, not really. He'd only severed its hold on the world, delayed its inevitable return. And as he stood in the heart of the chamber, surrounded by the remains of the ancient stones, he realized one undeniable truth. The balance had been shattered, and the world would never be the same. It was only a matter of time before the darkness found a way back. And this time, there would be no stone to save them. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. Ethan stood in the ruins of the chamber, the air thick with the strange silence that followed the destruction of the stones. His fingers still tingled with the residual energy from the broken relics, and his chest felt tight, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. The feeling that had been building inside of him, the dread, the unshakable sense of impending disaster, was now palpable, settling into his bones like cold iron. His gaze drifted down to the shards of stone scattered across the chamber floor. The cracks in the earth seemed to have spread outward from where the pedestal once stood, the fissures weaving in unnatural patterns. It was as if the land itself was unraveling, its foundation shaken to its core. The stones, once symbols of power, now lay broken, their purpose incomplete. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. Had he done the right thing? He hadn't meant to break the balance, hadn't intended to destroy everything in his path. But the force, the allure, the terrible compulsion to touch them, to bind them together, had been too strong. There had been no choice. Or had there? Was there another way he could have stopped the darkness without paying such a heavy price? A distant rumble echoed from deep within the bowels of the earth, vibrating through the stone beneath his feet. Ethan's heart raced. The land was shifting, adjusting, reacting to the broken stones. He turned to the exit of the chamber, his mind racing as he tried to gather his thoughts. The wind had picked up outside, though it was still unnaturally calm, too calm. A strange chill gripped the air, colder than before. The shadows seemed to lengthen around him, as if they were creeping, crawling, pushing toward him. The darkness hadn't been vanquished. It had only been sealed away, and now, with the stones broken, it had begun to stir once more, ready to reclaim the world. The voice from the depths of the chamber whispered again, as if from the farthest corner of his mind. The cycle is broken, yes, but it was never meant to be. You have only delayed what is coming. Ethan clenched his fists, the weight of that truth settling in. I can't undo it, can I? He muttered to himself. But deep down, he already knew the answer. The darkness, though dormant for now, would find a way to return, to twist the world back into its suffocating grip. His thoughts flickered to the people he had left behind, the village, his friends, the ones who had given their lives. Had he really saved them, or had he only delayed their suffering for a time? He couldn't answer that now, not when the stakes were so much higher. As he turned and moved toward the exit, the ground shook again, this time stronger, almost violent. He stumbled, bracing himself against the stone walls. Something deep within the earth groaned, a sound that felt like the land itself was screaming in agony. And then, from the farthest reaches of the chamber, a shadow emerged. Ethan froze, his heart thudding in his chest. A figure, tall, cloaked in darkness, with eyes that glowed an eerie, sickly yellow, stepped from the shadows, its form distorted, as though it was made of the very darkness he had tried to destroy. The figure was familiar, but Ethan couldn't place it. He felt a cold surge of dread wash over him, feeling that whatever it was, it had been waiting for this moment. He thought it could end it. The figure's voice was deep and hollow, like a storm echoing in a distant cavern. But you are wrong. This is not over. The darkness cannot be destroyed. It only waits, and it will always find a way back. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Who are you? The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, and it took a step closer, its form shifting with unnatural fluidity. I'm the keeper of what was, and what will be again. A chill crawled up Ethan's spine. He had heard those words before, or something similar to them. In the village, from the figure in the shadows. It was the same voice, the same presence. Ethan took a step back, the weight of his decisions crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He had thought the stones were the source of the darkness, but now he understood. The true source, the thing that had been manipulating everything all along, wasn't the stones. It was the force that had been behind them, the one that had been guiding his every move, the thing that had wanted him to fail. The darkness was never meant to be stopped. It was meant to return. The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, a grin that didn't reach its eyes. You cannot outrun fate, Ethan. You cannot fight what has always been. And now, you will see what the true cost of your defiance is. Before Ethan could react, the figure raised its hand, and the ground beneath him cracked open, sending him sprawling to the floor. He gasped as the earth split further, revealing something beneath the surface, something ancient, vast, and terrible. The dark stone that had once been broken now began to pulse with a new, more insidious energy. It was repairing itself, reshaping, regenerating. The other half of the stone, too, started to tremble, glowing faintly as if it were alive. It is too late, the figure hissed. The cycle will begin again. The darkness will rise, and you will not be there to stop it. Ethan pushed himself to his knees, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground continued to tremble as the dark stones reformed, fusing back together as one, more powerful than ever. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay, and the chamber seemed to close in on him, as though the world itself was pressing in, squeezing the life out of him. The figure laughed, its voice echoing in the chamber like the sound of thunder, dark and terrifying. You cannot destroy what was born from the earth itself. The cycle is eternal. It always finds its way back. With a final, resounding crash, the chamber shook violently, and the stones fused into one solid mass. The light from the stones flickered and surged, illuminating the darkness like a new dawn. Ethan's chest tightened, and as the last remnants of his strength drained away, he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. The stones, the darkness, they were never meant to be stopped. They were a part of the world, a force of nature that would always return, always consume. And now, Ethan knew that the true battle had only just begun. He had failed to stop it, and the darkness was waiting for its return. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the dark stone hummed with an ancient, malevolent energy, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat, steady, unyielding. The ground beneath him trembled as the figure's voice echoed through the chamber, deeper now, as though it were resonating from the bowels of the earth itself. You thought you could end it. The figure taunted, stepping closer, its shadow stretching across the chamber like an encroaching wave. You cannot stop what is eternal. The darkness is not a thing to be destroyed. It is part of the world's foundation. And now, you will see that your resistance only hastens its return. Ethan's body felt heavy, his limbs sluggish as if the very weight of the darkness were pressing down on him. He staggered to his feet, but the strength in his muscles was fading, drained by the overwhelming power of the stone. Every breath felt shallow, as if the air itself had thickened with despair. His eyes locked onto the glowing stone, now fully reformed and fused together. The once shattered shards had morphed into a single entity, even darker and more potent than before. Its surface swirled with an ominous energy, the veins of red running deeper, pulsating like blood in the veins of a living being. "What have you done?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. You were never trying to help me. You never wanted this to end." The figure tilted its head, its eyes gleaming with a dark amusement. "Help? No, Ethan. I am the keeper of the cycle. I was never your ally. I have been waiting, just as the darkness has been waiting. You did not break the cycle. You merely hastened its return. The earth will swallow this world whole, just as it always has." Ethan took a step back, trying to steady himself, his mind racing for a way out of the abyss that was swallowing him whole. He thought of the village, of the people he had fought for, the lives he had lost. All of it had led to this moment, the moment where he realized he had been playing into the hands of something far older, far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. But then, an ember of defiance sparked in him. He couldn't let it end like this. He couldn't accept that he had come so far, only to watch everything crumble. "I won't let it happen," Ethan said, his voice gaining strength as he clenched his fists. "There has to be another way." The figure's eyes narrowed. "There is no other way. You should have known that by now. The darkness was never meant to be stopped, Ethan. It is the foundation of the world, the balance. And you are merely a fleeting moment in that cycle." Ethan's gaze flicked toward the stone, the way it pulsed and shimmered with an unsettling energy. He had touched it once before, and it had nearly destroyed him. But this time, he understood that it was a key to something much larger, a force that he could not simply wish away. Without thinking, Ethan reached for the stone again. As his fingers brushed against its surface, the world around him seemed to blur, the chamber shifting, distorting. His body tensed as the energy from the stone surged through him, filling him with an overwhelming sense of power. "No!" the figure howled, but Ethan was beyond hearing it now. The power from the stone surged through him, flooding his veins like fire, burning away his doubts, his fears. The ground beneath him cracked, and the very air seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. For a moment, it felt like he was the stone itself, pulsing, vibrating, part of the earth, part of the darkness. He could feel it deep within him, the pulse of the cycle. But this time it was different. This time, the darkness was not just a force to be feared. It was something he could harness, something he could control. Ethan's vision blurred again, but this time, instead of fear, he felt clarity. He wasn't just fighting against the darkness. He was becoming it. A voice, softer now, whispered from deep within him, "You must wield it, Ethan. You must understand it. It is not a force to destroy. It is a force to balance, to control." The figure lunged toward him, but Ethan's hand shot out, his fingers now crackling with dark energy. A bolt of pure shadow erupted from his palm, striking the figure with a force that sent it crashing to the floor. The figure writhed in agony, its dark form twisting and contorting, but it couldn't escape the power Ethan now held. "What are you doing?" the figure gasped, struggling to regain its composure, its glowing eyes wide with disbelief. "You cannot control it. You cannot become it." Ethan stood tall, the power of the stone thrumming through him like a living thing. "Maybe I can't destroy it, but I can end the cycle. I can force the balance to shift." The figure laughed weakly, its voice trembling with both fear and amusement. "You cannot change the nature of the world, Ethan. You are nothing but a tool, a fleeting spark in the vastness of time." Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't falter. He couldn't afford to. The power he felt coursing through him, he knew it was dangerous, unstable, but it was his only chance. With a steadying breath, he focused his mind on the stone, on the pulsing darkness that now felt like a part of him. The energy grew, swirling around him like a storm, but Ethan wasn't afraid. For the first time, he felt like he could control it, shape it, bend it to his will. "I don't need to destroy the darkness," Ethan said quietly, his voice unwavering. "I need to master it." And with that, he unleashed everything he had. The power of the stone, of the darkness, surged outward in a massive, destructive wave, engulfing the chamber in blinding light. The figure screamed in agony, its form disintegrating in the light, torn apart by the very darkness it had once sought to control. The air crackled with raw energy, the very fabric of reality bending under the weight of the power Ethan had unleashed. When the light finally faded, the chamber was still. The ground, the walls, everything had been scorched by the release of energy, but Ethan stood unscathed. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart still pounding in his chest, but there was a sense of quiet, of finality. The figure was gone. The darkness was subdued, at least for now. But Ethan knew, deep down, that this victory was not permanent. The darkness was not a force that could be destroyed, not truly. It was a cycle that would always return. But for the first time, Ethan understood it, understood that the only way to end the cycle, to bring balance, was not through force, but through control. As he stood there in the ruin of the chamber, surrounded by the ashes of the battle, he knew that the world would never be the same. The darkness would always return. But now, he was ready to face it on his terms. The chamber was quiet now, the crackling of energy slowly dying away. Ethan stood motionless, his chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. The power that had coursed through him, the dark energy that he had once feared, still lingered in his body, swirling just beneath the surface like a dangerous current. But something had shifted inside him, something profound. The darkness no longer felt like an enemy to be destroyed. It felt like an extension of himself, something he could control, shape, and use. But at what cost? The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of burning stone and the faint, metallic tang of something ancient, something long buried. Ethan's fingers still tingled with the energy he had harnessed. He looked down at his hands, as if expecting them to be scorched or marked by the power he had unleashed, but there were no signs of injury. Instead, his hands felt different, stronger, more attuned to the pulse of the world around him. Mastery over the darkness. Ethan's mind echoed the thought, but at what price? His heart beat wildly, and his thoughts raced as the gravity of what he had done began to settle over him. The figure, the one that had guided him toward the stone's power, was gone, vanished in the blinding surge of energy. It had been consumed by the darkness that it had once sought to control. But even as the figure disappeared, Ethan knew that it was not truly gone. The forces it had manipulated were far too ancient, too ingrained in the fabric of the world to be simply erased. The darkness will always return. The figure's warning reverberated in his mind. The cycle is eternal. Ethan didn't know if he had truly ended the cycle, or if he had simply delayed it. It seemed as though every victory he had achieved only led him to a deeper understanding of the terrible truth. This battle was not one that could be won. The darkness was as much a part of the world as the light. The balance could not be destroyed, but neither could it remain unchanged. The only question now was whether he had the strength to live with the consequences of his actions. The echoes of the past still haunted him. The faces of those he had lost, his friends, his family, the villagers who had trusted him, flashed before his eyes. Had he really saved them? Or had he doomed them to a future where the darkness would eventually rise again, stronger than before? Ethan took a shaky step forward, his boots crunching on the charred ground, and moved toward the now shattered pedestal where the dark stone had once stood. The remnants of the stone lay before him, broken into jagged fragments, its glow now gone, the once pulsing veins of red dull and lifeless. He knelt down, his fingers grazing the pieces, feeling their cold surface. It was as if the power had drained from the very stones, leaving them empty, like the husks of something that had once been alive. But in the quiet aftermath, something gnawed at him, an unspoken realization. The power wasn't truly gone. It wasn't finished. It had only been redirected, refocused. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, distant at first, but growing steadily louder. The walls trembled, and Ethan felt the familiar pull of the earth beneath him, as if the land itself was stirring. A cold breath brushed against his neck, and he turned sharply, his heart racing. But there was nothing except the darkness. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence, a voice he had not expected to hear again. "You think you have one, Ethan?" Ethan spun around. There, emerging from the shadows where the light had faded, stood a familiar figure. It was not the same as before, not fully human. Its features were twisted, more shadow than substance, but there was a clarity in its gaze. The darkness had reshaped the figure, just as it had reshaped the world. "You have not destroyed the cycle, only embraced it," the figure continued, its voice deep and rumbling like thunder. "You are the keeper now. The darkness is yours to command, but it will never be content. It will never rest." Ethan's pulse quickened. He recognized the voice now. This was the same presence he had felt in the shadows before, the one that had manipulated him from the very beginning. "Why did you do this?" Ethan demanded, his voice strained. "Why guide me here if all you wanted was for me to take its power?" The figure's laugh was hollow, empty. "Because I knew you could never resist it. I knew you would come for the stones. You were always meant to carry the burden of the darkness. You are the one who has been chosen to wield it, to control it." Ethan stepped back, his mind whirling. "No, I didn't choose this. You did," the figure interrupted, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. "You sought the power to stop the cycle, but in doing so, you became part of it. The darkness has always been a part of you, Ethan. You are its heir, just as I was before you. And now, you will take my place." The weight of his words crashed down on him, and for a moment, Ethan felt the cold grip of despair clutch at his chest. He had thought he could control the darkness. He had thought he could master it, bend it to his will. But now he understood. The darkness wasn't something he could just wield. It was a force that consumed, a force that twisted all those who tried to control it. He whispered, the word barely a breath on his lips. "I won't let it control me." The figure's eyes burned with a fierce, knowing light. "You have already let it control you. You just don't know it yet." Before Ethan could respond, the ground beneath him cracked again, the wall shaking violently as a shadow rose from the depths. The chamber itself seemed to groan in pain, as if the land was being torn apart. And there, rising from the depths of the earth, was the dark entity, the embodiment of the cycle. It was vast, unfathomable, a swirling mass of shadows and light, an endless void that seemed to devour everything in its path. "The cycle does not end, Ethan," the figure whispered, fading into the shadows. "It simply waits for the next keeper. And now, you will carry it for as long as you can." Ethan's chest tightened. The reality of his situation crashed over him like a wave, the enormity of it threatening to crush him. The battle had never been about stopping the darkness. It had always been about surviving it. The entity surged forward, and Ethan stood tall, facing it. There was no more running, no more hiding. He had embraced the darkness, whether he wanted to or not. The cycle had begun again, and Ethan was now its unwilling keeper. The true battle was just beginning. Ethan's breath hitched as the entity loomed before him, a swirling vortex of shadow and light, its form ever shifting, as if it could not fully manifest into the physical world. The energy radiating from it was suffocating, pressing in on him, wrapping around him like an invisible web. He could feel it, the crushing weight of the darkness, the pull of its infinite hunger. It wanted him. It had always wanted him. But now he understood. The darkness wasn't a force that could be fought or erased. It wasn't something he could simply overcome. It was part of the very fabric of existence, a cycle that stretched back to the dawn of time. And now, whether he wanted it or not, it had claimed him. He was its keeper, its prisoner, and its unwilling partner. His chest tightened as the entity's form seemed to coalesce, its tendrils of shadow reaching out to him, brushing against his skin like cold fingers. Ethan stood frozen, not from fear, but from understanding. The figure's words echoed in his mind. You are the one who has been chosen to wield it. Ethan's eyes burned with a new resolve. He may not have chosen this fate, but he had the power to shape it. The darkness was not his master. He could control it. He could make the cycle bend to his will. He took a slow, measured step forward, his hand outstretched toward the entity. The darkness recoiled for a moment, as if testing him, sensing his hesitation. But Ethan pressed on, forcing the power of the stone to course through him once more, focusing all his energy on commanding it. The power inside him surged, rising up from deep within his chest, a rush of heat and cold that twisted his body with unnatural force. For a split second, the darkness faltered. Ethan's breath quickened, his heart hammering in his chest, but his will did not waver. He was not going to let the darkness consume him, not this time. He had already come too far. The entity howled, a sound that shook the chamber, its swirling form expanding and contracting like a dying star. Ethan's mind raced as he struggled to maintain control. This was no simple force. This was an ancient being, older than any of the worlds that had existed before it. But he was not helpless. He was the keeper now. He had to be strong. He had to control it. He closed his eyes and focused, pushing every ounce of energy he had into the stone, into the darkness itself. His body burned with the intensity of the power as it collided with the very essence of the entity. He felt the shadows tearing at his soul, trying to pull him under, to drag him back into the abyss. But he fought it. He focused on the calm, on the control. He felt the pulse of the earth beneath him, the rhythm of the world, and he used it to anchor himself. Slowly, the darkness began to recede, pulling back in on itself. The tendrils shrank away from him, the oppressive weight of its presence lifting, just for a moment. Ethan's eyes flew open, his breath ragged. The entity had not been defeated. It had been tamed. It writhed before him, but it no longer threatened to consume him. It was as if he had created a fragile barrier, a boundary that kept the darkness at bay. For now, it could not touch him. For now, he was in control. But Ethan knew, deep down, that this was only temporary. The darkness would never be fully contained. It would always fight, always strive to break free. And he would always be its keeper, bound to it, forced to wield its power. He staggered back, his legs shaking, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had used far too much energy. The chamber around him seemed to spin, the walls warping and bending with the overwhelming force of the battle. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp scent of burning stone, and the flickering light from the remnants of the broken stone cast long, distorted shadows across the room. A quiet voice, his own voice, somehow both distant and near, whispered in the back of his mind, "You're not done yet. You've only just begun." Ethan closed his eyes, fighting the nausea that was building in his stomach. The weight of the responsibility, was settling over him like a suffocating blanket. He had not won. He had only stalled. The darkness would return. It always did. But now he had the power to hold it back. Now he had the strength to contain it. I can't stop it, he whispered to himself. But I can control it. He reached down and grasped the broken shard of the stone at his feet. The remnants of the once mighty relic had lost their glow, but the sharp edges still glimmered in the low light, the dark veins of energy still swirling beneath the surface. It was a reminder of the power he now held, the power to control. He stood, taking a steadying breath, and looked toward the exit of the chamber. He didn't know what lay beyond it. He didn't know what the world would look like now that he had embraced the darkness, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go back. He couldn't undo what he had done. The cycle had already begun, and he was its keeper. But now he had a choice. Ethan walked toward the exit, his hand clenched around the shard of stone, his mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. What would he do with this power? What would it cost him? The world outside had to be prepared, because the darkness was not finished yet. Ethan stepped out of the chamber, the heavy stone door creaking as it closed behind him. The air outside was thick with the scent of earth and decay, but it was different now, quieter, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The weight of the darkness still clung to him, like a shadow, but there was something else too, a growing sense of inevitability. The ground beneath his feet felt different, vibrating with an unsettling hum. The energy he had just unleashed, the power he had pulled from the stone, had shifted something in the world. It was as if the earth itself had acknowledged his presence, had recognized his claim to the cycle. He could almost hear it, a low rumble beneath the surface of the earth, like the whisper of the wind before a storm. Ethan gripped the shard of the broken stone tighter, the edges digging into his palm. He wasn't sure if it was a symbol of his power or a constant reminder of the burden he now carried. Either way, it was his. He had accepted it. The path ahead of him was obscured by dense fog, the mist curling and coiling like tendrils of the very darkness that now lived within him. He didn't know where to go or what to do next. The world felt different, warped, as if it had shifted along with the energy in the chamber. He could feel it, the weight of something old and powerful pressing against his chest. A voice broke the silence, cutting through the fog like a blade. Ethan. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice was familiar, yet distant. It came from somewhere deep within the mist, barely above a whisper. Ethan, you've changed. He turned, squinting into the fog, but saw nothing. The mist seemed to grow thicker, twisting and churning around him like a living thing. The voice called again, but this time it was more insistent, more real. You're not the same. You never will be again. Ethan's stomach twisted. Who's there? He demanded, his voice sounding foreign, hollow in the dense silence. But there was no answer, only the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. His breath quickened, his hand tightening on the shard of stone. The darkness, the thing that had become a part of him, was reaching out, testing him. He could feel its pull, its hunger, just below the surface. He could feel the weight of it, waiting for him to falter, to give in. But he couldn't let that happen. Not now. With a deep breath, Ethan pushed forward, stepping cautiously into the thick fog. The path ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the mist swirling around him like a labyrinth. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every step he took felt heavier, like the earth itself was pressing down on him, as if it were both a prison and a sanctuary. And then, without warning, the mist parted. Ethan stumbled forward, his eyes widening at what lay before him. A massive figure stood in the clearing ahead, its silhouette obscured by the dim light that filtered through the fog. It was a shape that seemed to shift and change with every glance, an indistinct, ever-changing shadow. But Ethan could feel it. He could feel the immense power that radiated from it, the weight of something ancient, something primal. You've come, the figure said, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from all around him. "You are the keeper now." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "Who are you?" he demanded, but his voice came out as little more than a whisper, swallowed by the vast emptiness around him. "I am the one who came before you," the figure replied. "I was the keeper long ago, and now the darkness has found its new master." The figure took a step forward, and Ethan instinctively took a step back, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The presence of the figure was suffocating, as though the air itself was being drawn toward it. The figure said, a strange note of sorrow in its voice, "You cannot control it." Ethan's hand tightened around the shard of stone. "I can't control it," he said, forcing the words through clenched teeth. He could feel the power inside him, the darkness stirring. "I've already done it. I can wield it. I can make the cycle stop." The figure shook its head, a sound like a sigh echoing through the fog. "You cannot stop it, Ethan. You can only delay it. The darkness is not meant to be controlled. It is meant to be endured. The cycle is eternal. You are merely its keeper, a temporary guardian." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? What's the point of all of this then? If it's endless, why did I even—" "You cannot change the course of the world, Ethan," the figure interrupted, its voice like the whisper of the wind through dead leaves. "You have become what you fear most, and now you will watch the cycle repeat, over and over again, until you are no more than dust, and the darkness finds its next keeper." Ethan felt the ground tremble beneath him. The figure was right, he realized with a sickening sense of clarity. He had become a part of the cycle. He couldn't stop it. The darkness was both the beginning and the end, an eternal loop that fed on itself. "Then what do I do?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper, his body trembling with the weight of the truth. The figure stepped closer, its form shimmering like the reflection in water. "You endure," it said, its voice now more patient. "You carry the darkness as it has always been carried. You will learn its ways. You will become its master, its servant, its keeper. And in time, you will understand the true nature of what you hold." Ethan felt the cold grip of dread tightening around his chest. He had been given power, yes, but at what cost? The darkness had made its home inside him, and now there was no escaping it, no ending it. The figure raised a hand, and the mist began to swirl around Ethan again, pulling him back toward the edge of the clearing. "The world will change because of you, Ethan, but you must walk the path alone. You will see the cycle for what it is, and when it ends, you will be ready for what comes next." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to scream at the figure that this couldn't be the only way, but his voice faltered in his throat, swallowed by the weight of the truth that had been revealed to him. The figure's eyes glowed with ancient wisdom, and its presence began to fade as the fog consumed it once more. And then, the clearing was empty. The mist closed in, and the world around him seemed to fall silent once more. Ethan stood there alone, the keeper. The darkness was his now, and he would carry it forever. Ethan stood in the clearing, the thick mist swirling around him like a living thing, twisting and coiling with every breath he took. His heart still pounded in his chest, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on him. There was no escaping the truth now. He was bound to the darkness, a prisoner of the cycle, and no matter how hard he fought, it would always come back for him. The wind shifted, brushing against his face, and for a moment, he felt as though the very earth itself were whispering to him. The land had changed. It had felt his transformation, felt the power he had unleashed within it. Ethan wasn't sure if it was the earth itself speaking, or if it was just the darkness inside him stirring, but the sensation was palpable. The cycle had begun anew, and with it, the consequences. He clenched the shard of stone in his hand, the cold, jagged edges digging into his palm, as if trying to remind him of the power that now flowed through his veins. But it wasn't the stone that was powerful, it was what it had awakened inside him. It was the darkness. A low rumble echoed in the distance, and Ethan's pulse quickened. The sky overhead had grown darker. the storm clouds rolling in as though answering the entity's call. A storm was coming. No, it wasn't just a storm, it was the darkness gathering. The very thing he had once hoped to control was now encroaching on the world once more. The world, it seemed, was not ready for this. Ethan took a deep breath and turned away from the clearing, his feet sinking into the soft earth as he walked. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, the tremors of something ancient and powerful still rattling through his bones. He knew he couldn't stay here, this place, this moment. It was part of the past. His future was out there, somewhere in the world beyond. He stumbled through the fog, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick mist. But even as he walked, he could feel the darkness growing stronger, the pull of it intensifying with every step. It was as if it had always been there, just beneath the surface, waiting for him to acknowledge it, to give it the power it so desperately craved. He thought, the question echoing in his mind, what is there left to do? He had been given this burden, this power, this curse. There was no escaping it, no running from it. He could try to hide, to fight, but the cycle would always find him. A faint glimmer of light appeared ahead, a break in the mist, and Ethan quickened his pace. As he stepped into the light, he saw what had drawn him forward, a village. It was a place he had visited long ago. The memory of it was distant, a faded image in his mind, but he knew it. He knew the people. They had trusted him once, looked to him for answers. But now, Ethan was a different person. He wasn't the same young man who had once walked through these streets. The darkness inside him had changed everything. He could feel its presence in the air around him, seeping into every crack and crevice of the village, infecting the earth, the air, the very people. As he walked through the streets, he noticed the eerie quiet that hung over the place. There were no children playing, no laughter echoing through the alleyways. The windows of the houses were dark, the doors shut tight. There was no sign of life. Then he saw them. The people of the village, his people, stood at the center of the square. Their eyes were vacant, their faces pale and lifeless, like they had been drained of everything that made them human. They were not dead, but they were not alive either. They were caught in some kind of trance, their bodies standing in unison, unmoving. Ethan's heart sank as he realized what had happened. The darkness, the cycle, it had already begun to spread. It had touched the village. It had infected them, just as it had infected him. One of them, an older man with gray hair and a weathered face, stepped forward, his eyes slowly lifting to meet Ethan's. There was recognition in them, but also something else, something hollow, as if the man's soul had already been consumed. Ethan, the man whispered, his voice hoarse and empty. The cycle. It's begun again. Ethan took a step back, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. These people, these villagers, they were the price of his power. The darkness had taken hold of them, and he was responsible. He had been the one to unleash it. No, he said, his voice shaking. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't. But the man's voice interrupted him, cold and dispassionate. It doesn't matter now, Ethan, he said, his lips barely moving. You are the keeper. The darkness is yours to command, but it will always take from you. It will always leave its mark. Ethan fell to his knees, the weight of his guilt crushing him. He had thought he could control the darkness. He had thought he could stop the cycle, that he could save a world. But all he had done was set it in motion once more. The cycle could not be stopped. It could only be endured. The villagers stood motionless, their eyes fixed on him, unblinking, waiting. Waiting for what? For him to lead them? For him to guide them into the next phase of the cycle? But what could he do? How could he lead them when he wasn't even sure he could lead himself? He stood slowly, his legs trembling beneath him, and looked around the village once more. There was nothing he could do for them now. The darkness had already taken hold, and he could feel it crawling through the ground beneath him, the pulse of the cycle reverberating in his bones. He had to leave. He had to find a way to keep moving forward, to find a way to end the cycle, even if it meant destroying everything he had once loved. Ethan turned away from the village, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he could not save them. He could not save anyone. The cycle would continue, just as it always had. The darkness was eternal. But maybe, just maybe, he could make sure it didn't consume everything. For now, he had to be the keeper, and he had to survive. Ethan walked away from the village, his heart burdened with an unbearable weight. The villagers' hollow eyes haunted him, and the sharp, bitter taste of guilt clung to his tongue. He had thought he could change things, that he could stop the darkness from spreading, but now he knew better. The cycle had a life of its own, a force that was unstoppable. He was merely its keeper, its temporary guardian. He could not change its course. As he walked, the fog closed in around him once more, and the heavy silence of the land pressed down on him. The earth beneath his feet seemed to throb with the pulse of the darkness, an ever-present reminder that it was with him, inside him, and would always be. It was as if the land had accepted its fate, just as Ethan had reluctantly accepted his own. There was no going back. He had become part of the cycle. The darkness had claimed him, and nothing would ever be the same again. Eventually, he reached the edge of a vast, desolate forest. The trees loomed like towering sentinels, their twisted branches reaching for the sky. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper with each step. But Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped into the forest, his feet crunching against the dry leaves and dead twigs. In the distance, a faint light flickered, a pale glow barely visible through the thick undergrowth. Ethan's instincts guided him toward it. He had no idea what lay ahead, but something in the back of his mind told him that he had to go this way. There was something he needed to find, something that would give him answers or at least a chance for redemption. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer and more oppressive. The wind howled as though warning him, but Ethan pressed on, driven by something he couldn't quite name. He needed to know more. He needed to understand the darkness, its origins, and how he might control it, or at least contain it. After what felt like hours, Ethan finally stumbled into a clearing. At the center stood an ancient stone structure, its surface cracked and weathered by centuries of exposure. It was a shrine, its form both beautiful and foreboding. The stone pulsed with a strange, ancient energy, an energy that felt eerily familiar. Ethan approached the shrine, drawn to it, his body humming with the same energy that flowed through him now. As he reached the stone, the air around him grew heavy, and a voice echoed in his mind. "You've come to understand," it said, the voice deep, ancient, and filled with sorrow. "But you will not find the answers you seek. The cycle cannot be broken. You are the keeper, and the keeper's fate is sealed." Ethan staggered back, his breath quickening. The voice was not his own, and yet it felt like a part of him. The darkness, its true nature, was speaking to him. The stone glowed brighter, and in that moment, Ethan felt the weight of it all, the truth that he had been avoiding, the truth that had been slowly consuming him. You cannot fight it, Ethan. You cannot escape. The darkness is not just a force. It is the fabric of the world itself. It is the cycle of life and death, of creation and destruction. It is eternal, and you are its vessel. Ethan's chest tightened, a wave of despair crashing over him. He had known this on some level, but hearing it from a stone, the very thing that had started this nightmare, made it feel real. There was no escaping the darkness. It was not a force to be contained. It was a part of existence itself. "But I can't just accept this," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "I can't just let it destroy everything. I won't." "You do not have a choice," the voice interrupted, gentle yet unyielding. "You are the keeper, and that is all you can ever be. The cycle will continue, and you will watch as it consumes all that you love." Ethan fell to his knees, the weight of his fate crashing down on him. The stone pulsed with a dark, rhythmic beat, like the heartbeat of the world itself. He felt it in his bones, in his soul. He had no power here, not really. The darkness was beyond his control, beyond anyone's. Then what do I do? Ethan whispered, his voice raw with desperation. How do I stop it? You cannot, the voice answered. But you can endure. You can hold the darkness at bay for as long as you can. You are its keeper, and you will carry it with you, as all the keepers have before you. The ground trembled beneath him, and Ethan stood slowly, his body shaking. He felt the darkness within him stir, its pull growing stronger, more insistent. The voice had spoken the truth. He was trapped in an endless cycle. The keeper's fate was inevitable, just as it always had been. As the light from the shrine dimmed, Ethan knew that his journey was not one of salvation. It was one of survival. He had to keep moving, keep fighting, and try to hold the darkness back for as long as he could. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no end to the cycle. The darkness would always return. And so, Ethan walked away from the shrine, back into the forest. The mist closed around him again, and the darkness inside him swelled, becoming one with the night. He was the keeper, and he would carry the darkness for as long as it needed him. The cycle had no end, and neither did he.